Hello and welcome to this compilation episode on knights in fantasy world building. We're going to start with the general social conditions that give rise to knights and kind of why elite warriors arise at all. And then we're going to delve into the specific of the European knight, what gave rise to them and how they developed and their history, as well as their training methodologies and gear and so on. And then we're going to talk about some fantasy applications of creating elite warriors and how to develop an honor code specifically for your warrior. And then we will close out the compilation with the exercise of a day in the life of from World Building Blueprints, where we will cover details like how a knight would have lived and what their daily rituals were and what role various activities and foods and so on played in their lives. So I hope that you enjoy this very long compilation video, and I will see you again at the end. By the way, there are chapter stamps down below covering each one of the compilation videos if you do feel the need to jump between chapters and to return to various chapters. So I'll see you at the end. We love the image of the knight in shining armor, the noble protector, the hero who stands between the innocent and the dark. But if you're a peasant in the 14th century, that knight isn't a superhero. He's a high-maintenance apex predator leashed by his honor code. Today, we're peeling back the plate armor to look at the brutal anthropology of the honorable warrior. From the samurai to the jaguar warriors, we're going to find out why most successful societies eventually decide to feed, clothe, and even honor those that could destroy them. Welcome to another episode of Just-in-Time World Building with your host, Marie Mullaney. To understand where the concept of the honorable warrior comes from, we really need to talk about anthropological evolution and specifically the control of violence, because that need to ensure that violence doesn't rip our societies apart is what creates the archetype of the honorable warrior. Indulge me for a moment. I want you to think of yourself as the whole of humanity. Now, take yourself back to the pre-agricultural revolution time, to being a hunter-gatherer. Consider the environment that surrounds you. It's the world of biological evolution, survival of the fittest. We're one predator among many, and our superpower, our true dominant trait, is our ability to socialize and to work together. That means we have to exist as a tribe that can cooperate. And the most successful tribes, the ones who survive in this harsh environments, are the ones who are cognizant of that need to work together. And that brings us to the application of violence. Every person in a given tribe has to be capable of violence because of the nature of the environment. Some will, of course, be more capable of violence than others, by being more ruthless, stronger, or more aggressive, and so on. But violence is largely decentralized. However, violence cannot be tolerated in extreme within the tribe, or the necessary cohesion required for survival breaks. So, overt internal aggression is kept in check through shaming, ostracism, and even, in extreme cases, execution. And we see this, for example, in the Kung San, who ridicule aggressive men to prevent them from forming the dominant group. Bear in mind that we're talking about internal aggression. There is still plenty of external aggression through raids, feuds, and even homicides. Cooperation isn't about being good, it's about not getting killed. The tribes that survived were the ones that could balance cooperation with controlled violence, punishing those who threatened the group's cohesion. And this holds true for hunter-gatherers without a surplus. But hunter-gatherers who have a surplus, for example the Haida, tend to behave more like agricultural societies. So what is this surplus and how does it change the control of violence? When we discovered the marvels of agriculture, societies that routinely have a surplus of material goods started developing. This surplus starts as food, saving some grains and dried fish for the winter and for next year. But soon it develops into clothing, ceramics, glass, metal goods, houses, cars, spaceships, computing power, and so on. And that surplus is where the rub really lies. Think back again to those early agricultural societies. The surplus allows them to have specialized labor. They can be farmers who provide food in return for potters, who provide bowls in return for weavers, who make cloth, and so on. But what about the violence? Remember how I said that hunter-gatherers use social controls to keep overly aggressive warriors in line? Well, that stops working when your group grows so large that personal relationships can no longer be used to reward and shame people. At that point, you need institutions. And even more importantly, surplus creates inequality. In most hunter-gatherer societies, with those few exceptions I mentioned, no one can hoard because there's nothing to hoard. There is no surplus to hoard. But in agricultural societies, someone always tries to hoard the surplus, and they need armed enforcers to keep what they've taken. And so, some people start providing violence as specialized labor to protect, or even to take, the surplus. I don't think it's unfair or controversial to say that violence beats non-violence and takes its lunch money. So, the warriors of a society can turn on their own members and demand the whole surplus. But a society with only warriors who just takes what they want from the rest of their people most often cannibalizes itself because the non-warriors flee. And a society with no warriors most often gets invaded by a society with warriors. Which means in essence that society needs to find a balance between the warriors getting a slice of the surplus, but also not turning their violence inward to take all of the surplus. And this is where honor codes and the honorable warrior archetype comes in. The honor code of the warrior develops slowly through cultural evolution for, in my opinion, 3 reasons. 1. To direct violence outward against the enemies of the society. 2. To sell the idea of protection offered by the warriors to the non-violent majority of the society. In other words, it's a form of propaganda. And lastly, to prevent warriors from turning their violence on their own society. In other words, it's a means of controlling the warriors. But here's the thing, honor codes aren't just about control. They're also about identity and belief. The warriors who follow the code aren't just being manipulated. They buy into the myth of the code because it gives them purpose. And the non-warriors need to believe in the honorable warrior code because the alternative is chaos. The code isn't just propaganda. It's the glue that holds the system together. The idea of the noble warrior gives violence a higher purpose, whether it's defending the faith, upholding the cosmic order, or protecting the weak. This is a shared myth that makes the system tolerable for everyone involved. It's a story we tell ourselves about ourselves. And listen, there is nothing wrong with that, okay? I am not throwing stones at anyone. We need these myths to make our societies work, and this is one that holds us together. Okay, so the honor code gives birth to jaguar warriors, to knights, to the Chinese Shi, to the Polynesian Tu'a, and the Japanese samurai, and many more warrior archetypes over the millennia. Now, why did I take you on this journey? Because in order to understand the knight, you have to understand 2 things. The honorable warrior archetype develop comes from cultural evolution. It's a structure that we see develop again and again as the hunter-gatherer gives way to the agricultural specialist. And two, when I say that honor codes were developed to control the warrior, I am not referring to some shadowy conspiracy theory where there's a cabal of people deciding to develop these cultural structures. I mean that societies who developed these structures were more successful than those that didn't. And so, through cultural evolution, these structures survived. What about those exceptions? What about societies that didn't develop a warrior class, I hear you ask? Well, there are a few exceptions. The Zapotec were less militarized than their neighbors, but in time they were conquered by the Mixtec. In a modern example, Costa Rica doesn't have a military, but they rely on the United States to protect them externally while they maintain an internal police force. They're not warriorless, they're protected by someone else's warriors. And then there's one society that may have been genuinely warriorless. The Indus Valley civilization had no clear warrior elite as far as we can see. And while they're not around anymore, we don't think they were invaded. So maybe it is possible to not have a warrior class. But most large-scale societies developed some form of organized warrior. Now that we understand how the archetype develops, our next step is to discuss some real-world examples to develop the anatomy of a warrior code. Now that we've seen why these warriors exist, let's peel back the layers of the honorable warrior to see how different cultures built specific versions of this controlled burn of violence. Because while the niche is the same, the flavor of the code changes based on what society values most. And we'll start with the one you probably know best, the European knight. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Europe was a mess of fragmented power. The surplus was land. If you owned land, you had food. If you didn't, you lived on someone else's land, and much of the fruit of your labor belonged to that person. Heck, you were often basically a fixture of the land. Check out my video on feudalism for more details on that topic. Anyway, the knightly code, or chivalry, was essentially a property management manual backed by the church. The anatomy of their code was built on vassalage. A knight wasn't just a guy in armor. He was a man who traded his violence for a fief, a piece of land. His honor was tied to his word. If he broke his oath to his lord, he didn't just lose his reputation, he lost his source of income. If the lord could take it back. Feudalism is complicated. Anyway, the church, seeing all these thugs in horseback tear up the countryside, added a layer of piety. They told the knights, you aren't just killers, you are the militia Christi, the soldiers of Christ. This directed that violence away from the local Christian peoples and toward the infidel and the heretic. But if you move east, the anatomy shifts. In ancient China, the Shi were the warrior nobles of the Shang and the Zhou dynasties. Their code wasn't just about bravery, it was about ritual, or li. A Shi warrior had to be an archer and a chariot driver, sure, but he also had to understand music and courtly rites. Why? Because in a massive, centralized bureaucracy, violence that isn't ritualized is just chaos. Now, the Shi's a little complicated because eventually the Chinese realized that a warrior who thinks too much for himself is dangerous to the emperor. So, through cultural evolution, the Shi eventually transitioned from armored warriors into scholar bureaucrats. They traded the sword for the brush, but kept the honor, shifting the warrior code into the civil service code. The honorable warrior became the honorable administrator. Which is a very interesting evolution, if you think about it, and one we can apply to fantasy world building, as we'll talk about a little bit later. Then you have the Polynesian Tua and the Hawaiian Alii. Hope I'm getting those right. In these island societies, the surplus was often limited, so the code was built on something intangible, mana. Mana is spiritual power, and violence was the way you proved you had it. And for the Polynesians who followed this way of life, which wasn't everyone, to be clear, the warrior is the sacred vessel. Their violence was deeply communal. A Maori warrior's haka isn't just a dance, it's a display of controlled energy. Their honor was tied to the prohibited, tapu. There were lines you didn't cross, because if you did, you didn't just lose your status as a warrior, you lost your soul and endangered your entire tribe's spiritual safety. The code here wasn't about a contract with a lord or with the emperor, it was a contract with your ancestors. These three examples make it pretty clear how the ideology of the culture blends with the honor codes of the warrior. And in all three cases, we've spoken about directing violence outward. But the honorable warrior doesn't always point the blade at the outsider. This brings us to the dark underbelly of the honorable warrior, their role as social border patrol. Sadly, knights didn't always rescue damsels. If you were a peasant in 14th century France and you decided taxes were too high, the honorable knight wasn't your protector. He was the guy who rode into your village and burnt your barn to remind you of your place in the natural order. The honor code creates an in-group and an out-group. If you're a member of the nobility or of the protected weak that the knight shields, he'll treat you with chivalry. But if you are a norm breaker, a rebel, a heretic, or someone from a different tribe, the code often authorizes extreme violence against you. Think of the Aztec eagle and jaguar warriors. To their own people, they were the pinnacle of virtue. But their honor was literally measured in how many outgroup people they could capture for human sacrifice. Their code demanded bravery, yes, but it was a bravery used to enforce the religious and political status quo. The honorable warrior is often the ultimate deterrent. They are the person who says, stay within the lines of our society and I am your shield. Step outside those lines and I am the sword that cuts you down. And it's important to remember that when you're designing your knights or their equivalent in your world. Yes, they often do protect the weak, and they are bound by a code, and they do believe in that code. I'm not saying they're hypocrites, but they are also enforcers of the norms and the elites of society. But how do you build that code? Well, I like to break it down into 4 elements. 1. Direction. Who do we hit? Outsiders, heretics, etc. 2. Restraint. How do we hit? No dirty fighting, show no mercy. Anything like that. Basically, what are the rules of engagement? 3. Propaganda. Why do we hit? To protect the weak, to gather sacrifices for the gods, to maintain the blessings of the ancestors, to maintain the celestial bureaucracy, and so on. And finally, 4. What turns one of those we protect into one of those we attack? Heresy, rebellion, slandering the ancestors, and so on. And then I write 1 or 2 tenets of the code for each of these elements. And if you want a deeper dive into specific codes of the warrior, check out my earlier video on that topic, linked in the information card. And now, since this channel is about fantasy, let's talk about how to apply the honorable warrior to non-humans and magic. If you followed me this far, you realize that the honorable warrior is a solution to a problem, the specialized monopoly on violence. But in fantasy, we have a second, often more terrifying specialized labor: magic. If violence beats non-violence and takes its lunch money, then magic beats violence and takes the whole lunch room. Think about it. If a knight is a specialized laborer of physical force, a mage is a specialized laborer of reality itself. In a world with magic, the surplus isn't just grain or gold. It's the fundamental power to heal, to destroy, or to manipulate the mind. And just like we saw with hunter-gatherers, a society can't function if someone is using that power to be a predator in the garden without any restraint. This is where the honorable warrior archetype evolves into the honorable mage. When you look at a system like Brian McClellan's powder mages, you see this anthropological pressure in action. The powder mages are essentially knights of the industrial age. They have a specialized ability, snorting gunpowder to gain superhuman speed, strength, and marksman abilities. They are that controlled burn of violence personified. But look at how their society treats them. They aren't just random people with powers. They are organized into a military caste with a strict hierarchy and a sense of duty to the state. Why? Because a powder mage without a code is just a domestic terrorist. The honor of a powder mage, their loyalty to the Adran army, is the only thing that keeps the non-magical majority from living in absolute terror of them. It's the propaganda of "we are your defenders" combined with the control mechanism of "the military structure will execute us if we go rogue." In that world, traditional mages are also controlled. There are the royal cabals of the most powerful mages who are wielded by the monarchs and are controlled by their oaths to said monarchs. And if your magic can make the laws of physics shut up and sit down, you need this. In a high magic setting, the need for an honor code becomes desperate because the scale of violence is so much higher. A knight can kill 10 peasants before he gets tired. A sorcerer can burn a city in a heartbeat. So, binding them through oaths and codes into self-policing entities is a good way to go. After all, knights can go after another knight, so a mage can go after a mage that has broken their oath. Indeed, you could create a whole order of anti-magic enforcers who control rogue mages through specialized equipment and training. But magic isn't our only complication in fantasy, so let's talk about non-humans. When we apply this anthropological lens to orcs, dwarves, or elves, we have to look at their biological strengths. Consider a race like the orcs. If they are naturally stronger and more aggressive than humans, their honorable warrior code won't look like European chivalry. It might look more like the Maori Tao or the Aztec jaguars. Their code could be designed to prevent their natural strength from shattering their own societies. An orcish knight isn't someone who is polite at dinner. He's someone who has mastered his inner berserker so that he doesn't kill his own kin during a dispute. His honor is tied to his self-mastery. Conversely, look at dwarves. If they live in subterranean environments where a single cave-in can kill everyone, their warrior code could be built entirely around holding the structure. A dwarven knight's honor isn't about glory, it's about holding the line. Because if the line breaks, the tunnel falls and everyone dies. Their code is one of absolute rigid collective duty, the ultimate control of violence for the sake of the survival of the tribe. When you're sitting down to write your society and to build your honorable warrior, here's some questions to ask. 1. What is the biggest violence? Is it strength, magic, gunpowder, the abilities of an elf? 2. How are those that wield that violence controlled? What is the essence of their honor code? And 3. What story are they telling the non-violent? We are holy, we are just, or we're the only things keeping the dragon away. The knight is a mask. Underneath that mask is the apex predator that we, as society, have decided to feed, clothe, and honor, both so that it doesn't eat us, and so that it protects us from other apex warriors. It is a mutual agreement. And that is the true magic of the honorable warriors. It is what captures the imagination. It is an anthropological trick that many successful societies have mastered, of turning a threat into a pillar of the community. And now, while the names of the absolute legends who support this channel scroll by, let's turn this whole conversation around. Everything we've discussed so far assumes a divide. The specialized, violent class on the one side and the sedentary, non-violent population on the other. But history, and some great fantasy, gives us an alternative, the warrior-citizen model. In this system, the honorable warrior isn't a specialized laborer you hire or tolerate. Being a warrior is the entry fee for humanity. In civilizations like Republican Rome or classical Sparta, if you didn't fight, you didn't count. You weren't a protected, non-violent member of society. You were just nothing. You were a non-person, a metic, or a slave. In Sparta, the honor code wasn't propaganda sold to the weak, it was the social glue of the elite. The homomoi, the peers, followed a code of absolute equality and martial excellence. But that code didn't apply to the helots, the enslaved population they brutalized every year just to keep them in line. This flips our honorable warrior model on its head. In this model, the warriors aren't protecting society. The warriors are the society. Everyone else is just the infrastructure. So this is an illustration of how you can make a society where warriors extract everything. And that can work if you have enough warriors who are bound together in a code. If you're world building, that's a potent tool. Imagine a dwarven hold where you only get a vote if you've served 10 years on the Dark Frontier. Or a Starship Trooper-style sci-fi setting where service earns citizenship. I read a children's fantasy once about the Legionnaires of Muros, where they essentially were such a warrior culture. In these worlds, the honor code is a way of creating the ultra in-group. It makes the warriors into a sacred brotherhood, which makes them even more effective at suppressing the nothings who do everything else in society. It is a much darker and more exclusionary version of the warrior archetype, but it's one that has shaped our world just as much as the lone knight in shining armor. Anyway, food for thought while you're looking at the names that scroll past, because these people are the ones making the specialized labor of world-building education that keeps happening on this channel. A knight on this side. A tiered gangster on this side. These two guys, they're the same. Not in weapons, not in fashion, not in accent, but in structure. They both exist inside systems that are part pyramid scheme, part protection racket, and those systems work for their purpose. I recently watched Isaac Arthur's Space Feudalism video, and I want to give my thoughts. Now, I won't be rehashing his points. Instead, I'll be talking about what feudalism is at its core and why it actually should be a very common form of government in fantasy worlds. So, let's dive into what feudalism actually is. Feudalism isn't about paganry. It's not about castles or courts or even the divine right of kings. At its heart, it's a workaround, an improvised way of holding power when you don't have the tools to manage a state properly. You can't afford a full bureaucracy. You don't have reliable communications. You can't guarantee justice, defense, or basic services across your whole territory. So instead, you offer pieces of it to powerful people. And you say to those people, you hold this land, you extract value from it, and in return you serve me and you give me a portion of what you extract. And that's why my first explanation of feudalism is always that it is a political pyramid scheme. It's a layered network of obligations and resource skimming. At the bottom sits the people doing the raw work, the peasants. They generate value, historically through farming, perhaps sometime in the future through mining or coding or any other form of labor. The important part is this: the peasants don't own the resource they're using to extract value from. They pass that value up to the lowest rung of the pyramid scheme almost in total. And then each feudal noble in the hierarchy takes a cut and passes the rest up. Okay, sure, I hear you say, but why would the peasants tolerate this? Even with technological advantages on the side of the nobles, surely they can overwhelm the noble with pitchforks if they have to. Certainly. But this is where the protection racket comes in. Everyone in this system is both a collector and an enforcer. You give loyalty up the chain because you want protection down the chain. If your neighbor raids your village, it's your lord who rides out to stop them, or doesn't. If the bandits burn down farms, your knight breaks up those raids, or fails. That's why feudalism most often rises in unstable and dangerous environments. Because feudalism absolutely depends on three things: personal violence, personal loyalty, and delegated responsibility from the top. If your noble isn't protecting you from the ravages of the world, then it is indeed time to rise up with your pitchfork. So nobles must personally lead defences and enable peasant safety. And if they're doing their job, the peasant forks over most of their income for that protection. Pretty much like a triad or mafia protection racket, except feudalism was and probably will be in the future sometime legal. And if you think I'm pushing the metaphor, go look up Kowloon Walled City. That's a 6.3-acre slum in Hong Kong that was governed by no one. And it attracted people from the edges of the law. So what happened? Triads filled the vacuum, offering protection, resolving disputes, and enforcing rules. They weren't landlords, but in a very real sense, they acted like a de facto feudal lord. It is what it is. Heck, knights and triad members even share the same obsession with getting respect from the peasants. And for the same reason. Their reputation is critical in minimizing fighting. If people are awed into giving respect, they're not thinking of reaching for that pitchfork. But you have to give feudalism this. When it works, it turns chaos into order at a local level, even when the central state is absent or irrelevant. It can provide safety for the people under the knight's umbrella against whatever hostile forces exist in their environment. Again, Kowloon ran. It worked despite the complete absence of official governance. Sometimes, feudalism is just the deal you have to make with a local protector in order to survive. And that brings us to our second topic. What conditions need to be in play for feudalism to arise? Feudalism isn't some kind of natural state. It's a response to certain conditions. It tends to emerge when several conditions are present. Your central authority is weak or distant. Threats are real and local. Administrative capacity is low and the bureaucracy is weak. And cultural cohesion among the elite is high. The last one is often overlooked, but it is essential. Feudal systems don't survive purely on fear. They survive because the people at the top believe they're supposed to be at the top. And more importantly, that they belong there together. They recognize and respect each other as peers, even when they're rivals, even if they're at war. which is why nobles were taken hostage in the Middle Ages rather than just being killed most of the time. And that peerage is built on a shared culture of honor, chivalry type codes, lineage, religion, or at the very least, mutual advantage. If elite cohesion breaks down, for whatever reason, cracks form hard and fast. Take the War of the Roses in England. This brutal civil war wasn't caused by foreign invasion or peasant revolt. It was nobles turning on each other because the shared sense of hierarchy and legitimacy within the aristocracy collapsed. Rival factions no longer accepted each other's right to rule, and the system spiraled into dynastic warfare. Or look at the investiture controversy in the Holy Roman Empire, a power struggle between emperor and pope over who had the authority to appoint bishops. This dispute tore apart loyalties among nobles and clergy alike because it challenged the ideological glue that held the elite order together. In both cases, feudal structures took a lot of strain and began to fall apart, not because of peasants, but because the elites could no longer agree on who was in charge of what and what the rules were, or whether they were even still on the same team. This is why in most stable feudal systems you see elite marriages, shared rituals, a common language, and usually some form of indoctrination that tells everyone that these are the elites and they're on the same team, even when they're clearly not and are actively fighting each other. Quite often, you also see religious or philosophical legitimizing elements like the European divine right to rule during the Middle Ages, because the noble was selected by God for this position. They were literally born better. And of course, all of this ties back to enforcing respect from the peasants, the guys actually doing the labor. It's why back-chatting a knight will get you whipped or hanged if you're a peasant, because the elites have to remind that peasant that they're in control and they have the right to be in control. Their might makes right. Their might protects you, but only as long as you're respectful. And that brings us to one last point I want to make about feudalism before we head into the fantasy realm. Feudalism demands personal action, because systemic rules just don't exist under feudalism. There are no HR departments, no ombudsman, no chain of appeal. Everything, order, justice, stability, flows from one guy on a horse making a call right there in the field. And that is both its greatest strength and its most dangerous flaw. See, a noble doesn't lead from behind a desk. He leads from the front. His power isn't abstract. It's made real by his body, his voice, and the armor on his back. That's why knights and lords literally rode out to fight, because their authority came not from the title, but from their presence on the field, from people seeing them show up, sword drawn, to defend the village or collect the tax. That's where technological edge mattered. Castles, war horses, chainmail and plate armor, all of it made the noble untouchable, but also enabled them to actually fight for the peasant, to ensure peasant safety. Feudalism is a system that depends entirely on a person. If your local lord is smart, brave, and fair, things might go great. If he's corrupt or lazy or gets an arrow through the neck, everything falls apart. There's no backstop, there's no process. That makes feudal societies inherently fragile. Economically too. You don't get long-term growth or trade booms when your local tax rate depends on whether your baron had a bad week. That's why economies really start to flourish under bureaucratic rule. Bureaucracies may be boring and they may be tiresome to work with, but they're predictable Predictability makes contracts work. It makes investment possible. Feudalism, by contrast, is a gamble. It works when strong people act well, and it collapses when they don't. So yes, personal leadership is heroic, it's dramatic, it's cinematic, but it's also deeply unstable. And that's why it makes great stories, but terrible economies. When I was researching this video, I came across a guy on YouTube lionizing feudalism, like it was some kind of lost golden age when Europe was in the Middle Ages. And I just kind of sat there, blinking at the screen. Look, I'm not here to villainize feudalism. It worked in certain times and places. It brought stability where there wasn't any. But the reason you and I have access to more comfort, wealth, and innovation than any medieval king could dream of is because we live in predictable systems. Systems where thousands, even millions of people can invest their time, skill, and resources into building things without having to ask a knight for permission or bribe a baron or worry about what the next knight down the road is going to say about what they're doing. During medieval Europe's feudal period, invention and innovation were sporadic at best. But do you know where innovation boomed during that same period? In Song Dynasty China, under a strong, centralized, meritocratic bureaucracy. Gunpowder, the compass, movable type printing, paper money, civil engineering. They had literally all of that. Why? Because their government was stable, coordinated, and merit-driven. Now, to be clear, the Song dynasty didn't last forever. Their bureaucracy didn't collapse. Their army failed. They prioritized internal administration and intentionally weakened the military to prevent warlord uprising. And what happened? They got punked by the Jurchens, who invaded from the north and carved out half the empire. And just when the Songs settled into ruling the south, the Mongols showed up and finished the job. The Song is maybe the greatest historical example of a civilization doing everything right, except remembering that the world is violent. They revolutionized printing, commerce, and governance. But the system didn't fall because of mismanagement. It was simply outmatched by an organized external force to which they had neglected their own defenses. And it's a brutal reminder that good governance means nothing if you can't defend it. And as a European and a Finn, I really hope it's a lesson Brussels is taking to heart in this time. I think it is. We're spending more on our military than we were before. But reading about the Song collapse and researching this video and some others, honestly, it was kind of nerve-wracking in how much it rhymes with our recent past. Great governance. Maybe need some more men with guns. Anyway, my point is, we've got problems in the modern world. Big ones. Systemic ones. And yes, a lot of our governance institutions need reform. But burning the whole thing down and going back to knights and honor isn't going to fix anything. Unless, of course, you plan to be the guy on the horse. And let me tell you something. Most of us in that system are going to be the peasants. And that probably includes you. Okay, enough of that. Before we talk about magic and feudalism, give me just a moment to tell you about Worldbuilding Blueprints. It's a book I wrote about world building that has over 80 exercises and worksheets and guides your world building from zero to hero, helping you create a fantasy world that supports your story, including this worksheet that will help you design a might makes right government. And if that sounds interesting to you, you can check it out below. It's been fully funded and all its stretch goals met on Kickstarter, but is still open for late pledges until about November-ish. Or, if you're watching after that period, you can buy it from my website. Alrighty, let's move on to magical feudalism. Add magic to any given world, especially hereditary or rare magic, and it only reinforces the chance of feudalism. Magic becomes another version of land, armor, or lineage, something that justifies unequal power. That's why so many fantasy worlds, even if unintentionally, end up reinforcing feudal logic. If your ability to affect the world, to defend, rule, or even survive depends on you personally being powerful, then the structure that emerges is always going to be that hierarchical pyramid model. Whether it's wizards or bloodlines or dragon riders or chosen ones, if the world doesn't run on systems, it runs on people and their personal power. And that means dominion follows might. And just like in real history, it doesn't really matter why someone is powerful. Whether it's magic or martial skill or control over a giant teleporting war elk, what matters is that power is concentrated, not distributed. And wherever power is concentrated, you get that pyramid. Writers of fantasy don't necessarily copy medieval Europe, though that does happen too, let's be fair, a lot of writers copy medieval Europe. But the physics of the world quite often demands feudalism. If there are no reliable systems, no mass literacy, no fast communication, no bureaucratic state, then the only thing that holds the realm together is the proximity to someone stronger than you, and hence feudalism, because you need the mage to defend you from other mages, if nothing else. I myself leaned into this in Sangwheel Chronicles, my epic fantasy series. My nobles are all mages because in the Empire, my magic system looks like a hereditary one. That's not completely accurate, but that's a story for another day. So, when you're creating your magic system, ask yourself, does power live in systems or in people? Can a noble rise by using institutions? Or would people follow them if they suddenly threw fireballs around? If it's the second, you're in a feudal system with or without castles. Feudalism is extremely good at creating local stability in chaotic environments and at scaling rule across distances where central governance can't reach. And that's why it also works in space feudalism, as Isaac Arthur said in his video. When you're far from central governance and you need a strong warrior to keep everyone safe, feudalism is just the best go-to structure because it handles violence, power, and loyalty very, very well. And in high-risk settings like magical frontiers or space colonies, that's often what matters most. How well do you handle violence? The thing about feudalism is, it's sticky. Once it sets in, the elite have every reason to keep it going. And they have all of the resources because all of the power is concentrated in their hands. Their children inherit power, their allies reinforce it, and their ideology wraps it in honor, religion, or cosmic order. It becomes very hard to shake feudalism. And normally it requires either the elite cohesion to shatter or peasant labor to become inordinately valuable, as happened in the Black Death period in Europe, or frankly both. And even when feudalism breaks down, its bones remain. And that's why we still have titles and loyalties that echo in Europe to this day in the constitutional monarchies. And it's why there was that guy on YouTube talking about the golden age when people ruled by the divine right of blood. It's an idea that's hard to kill. Anyway, back to our two guys from the start. You've got your knight, you've got your gangster. One holds a fief granted by a king. The other runs a block granted by a boss. They collect tribute. They offer protection. They enforce loyalty with violence or the threat of it. They're obsessed with getting respect. These guys are not anomalies. They're structural to dangerous environments where you need the protection of somebody who is good and willing to engage in violence. And that's my thoughts on feudalism and fantasy. If you've made it this far, drop a pitchfork or a clippy in the comment to show peasant solidarity. Or a crown if you're one of those. I don't judge. Too much, anyway. The stirrup thesis claims that without this little loop of metal, the world of fantasy as we know it simply wouldn't exist. No King Arthur, no Jaime Lannister, no Paladins. Now, I'll admit, the stirrup and the saddle development that accompanied it surely did help the knight. It allowed an armored warrior to deliver a devastating blow with a lance without being catapulted off the back of their own horse. But that wasn't actually what gave rise to the knights. The stirrup might have provided the hardware, but it didn't provide the paycheck. A knight is, effectively, a medieval tank, and tanks are expensive. To build a class of elite, mobile warriors, you need some way to pay them, and that's where an awful lot of complexity entered the political picture of knighthood. Today, in our first video in a series about knights, we're looking at the bloody, bureaucratic, and deeply practical origins of the knight. Welcome to another episode of Just-in-Time Worldbuilding with your host, Marie Mullaney. Before we get into the shining armor and the codes of honor, we have to talk about the business model behind knights. The truth is, in the early Middle Ages, being a knight was less of a calling and much more of a career path for the heavily armed warrior. To understand where the knight comes from, you have to look at two very different traditions crashing together. On the one hand, you had the Roman equites, essentially a social class of people who were simply rich enough to own a horse and were part of the military of Rome. But then, wasn't everyone? On the other hand, you had the Germanic tradition of the comitatus, a war band of elite warriors bound by their blood oaths to their chieftain. And that takes us back to that very pivotal moment in history, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. After the collapse of Rome, there was much chaos in the land. Maybe. I'm currently reading Goliath's Curse, which is a very interesting take on societal collapse, which I'll make some videos about later. But for now, let's focus on the idea of chaos in the land. Order was slowly restored in a patchwork way by warriors taking control of their local environments. The strongest of these, in the timeline we're picking up, were the Merovingians, the long-haired kings. And I have made a video about them previously because they had the most insane family history you've ever seen. Check it out in the info card for inspirations from history. Anyway, the Merovingians were the successors to Roman Gaul, and they tried to keep the Roman dream alive by relying on taxation to create a standing army, because that's what they wanted, a professional standing army paid in coin, just like the legions. There was, however, a problem with that. Whether there was chaos in the land or not, the Roman administrative machine was surely dead. Infrastructure was crumbling, trade was shrinking, and the bureaucracy required to collect taxes had evaporated. Without tax revenue, the Merovingian kings couldn't pay a standing army, and thus they reverted to that German tradition of comitatus. I'm pretty sure you can see the problem here. Voluntary warriors are famously hard to control, what with all that voluntariness. And by the 7th century, the Merovingian kings had become the do-nothing kings, losing their power to their chief of staff, the mayor of the palace. And that brings us to the rise of the Carolingians, who ushered in the era of the knight. The Frankish kingdom as we know it was seized by a family of those self-same mayors of the palace, and it all started with Charles Martel, also called Charles the Hammer, a man who gets way too little credit in history. After the Battle of Tours in 732, Martel realized that the Frankish infantry, mostly part-time farmers with shields, and the German comitatus tradition just could not effectively counter the highly mobile, fast-striking cavalry threats coming from the Umayyad Caliphate, who had taken Spain at this point. So Charles needed a permanent professional cavalry force, but the Merovingians had proven that there just was not the tax base for this. There was not money in the treasury. And this is where Charles broke from the Merovingian tradition, and he did something pretty radical to pay his cavalry force. He seized church lands. He took vast estates from the church and handed them out to his most loyal warriors. This was the political start of the knighthood. These fiefs were not actually a gift. They were a contract between liege and warrior. The liege promised to give the warrior land, also called the benefice, and the warrior got all the income from that land and the peasants who worked on that land. They could purchase a war horse, expensive armor, weapons, and so on. The knight, that is. The knight could purchase all these things. In return, the warrior promised to ride at the liege's command. Answer the liege's call to banners and all that. Pippin, Charles Martel's son, expanded on this culture and basically cleared away the last of the Merovingians. And Martel's grandson, Charlemagne, was the capstone on the project, as it were. By the time Charlemagne took the throne, this system of proto-feudalism was the backbone of the Frankish Empire. And Charlemagne turned that contract into a formal hierarchy. He needed to govern a territory that stretched from modern-day France to Germany and Italy. And without a centralized bank or a telephone, the only way to hold that territory together was to franchise it out to these armored elites, and that brings us to the pyramid scheme of governance: feudalism. Feudalism created a massive power shift. The knight was no longer just a guy on a horse raiding a village. He was a local landlord with a monopoly on violence. It's here that the stirrup plays its part, though it wasn't the only factor. The development of the high-backed war saddle actually did much of the heavy lifting to keep riders seated during a charge. We'll be diving deep into the hardware of a knight later in this series. Anyway, this Carolingian shift in how we paid for war changed the value of the human being inside the armor. Just think through the implications here. Under the old Merovingian system, if a warrior died, you just found another warm body, slapped a spear onto him, and you were good to go. But under the Carolingian franchise model, the knight represented a massive capital investment. More than a reward, the thief was a production facility for the knight. It took years of surplus grain, wool, and peasant labor to fund a single knight's panoply. If that knight kicked the bucket in a ditch, the king didn't just lose a soldier, he lost the military output of an entire estate. And that is how we got ransom culture. By the High Middle Ages, the battlefield began to look less like a place of slaughter and more like a high-stakes commodities market, at least from a knight's perspective. let's be real, the peasant levies, they still got slaughtered. If anyone asks me why I don't want to live in the past, that's why. The chances of me being a knight and being, or one of the cool kids on the battlefield that got captured for ransom, vanishingly small. The chance of me being one of the peasants holding a spear I barely know how to use, freaking massive. If you were a knight and you managed to unhorse your opponent, your first thought wasn't, I must get off my mount and slay this enemy. No. It was, I'm about to buy me a second castle. You would capture your opponent, treat him with a bizarre level of hospitality, essentially putting him up in a 5-star hotel, or the medieval equivalent, which, wasn't really a 5-star hotel, but anyway. And then you would just wait for his family or his tenant peasants or whoever to scrape together enough gold to buy him back from you. Through this asset recovery mechanism, war became a business for the social elite, where the primary concern of knightly courts was often the collection of ransoms rather than the pursuit of any abstract sense of honor. We see the DNA of this, the business of knighthood, all over our fantasy worlds, where it usually serves as the reality check for our protagonists. Take George R.R. Martin's A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. Well, the adaptation is called A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. The original books is Duncan Egge's books, and they're great, and I enjoy the adaptation. Anyway, Sir Duncan the Tall is a hedge knight. He has the gear of a knight and the title, but he has no land. He is essentially a freelance contractor in a world built on franchises. For Dunk, losing a single joust means a complete loss of livelihood, as we see in the early episodes of that show on HBO. The laws of chivalry dictate that the winner claims the loser's horse and armory, and without a fief to pay for replacement, Dunk is one bad day away from being a peasant once more. Or consider Tamora Pierce's Protector of the Small series. While Caladri of Mindolin is driven by a genuine, semi-modern sense of justice and honor, she operates in a system where the old guard of Tortal treats war like a sport for the landed gentry. The knightly thing to do is to capture the noble enemy and treat them well, while the common soldiers, the ones without a fief to their name, are often slaughtered because there's no profit in keeping them alive. Now, before I tell you about the church's response to the seizing of property and the rise of chivalry, give me one moment to tell you about Sangwil Chronicles, which is where I have my own version of knights, though they're not so horse-orientated because of, well, magic. Sangwil Chronicles is Louis' story, and he is an assassin that one reviewer described as a medieval James Bond. The series is complete at 4 books and is available on my website as an ebook box set with 8 pieces of human-drawn character art included as high-res images. Or you can get the physical copies via Amazon or any other online bookshop. Oh, and on a side note, I won Flash 500's novel opening competition in 2025, so at least you know that I can write reasonably well. Links to all that down below. If you use Night 2026 on my website, you'll get a 20% discount on all digital books on my website. Okay, enough of that. Let's get back to knights. Now, if you're the church in the 9th and 10th centuries, you have a problem. Charles Martel might have saved Western Christendom at the Battle of Tours, but he did it by effectively mugging the church for their lands. By the time the Carolingian Empire began to fracture, Europe was left with thousands of heavily armed, land-owning, chest-thumping warrior types with a lot of spare time and a literal monopoly on violence. And let me tell you, these early knights, they were no one's idea of a Galahad. They were more like state-sponsored biker gangs. When they weren't fighting for their lords, They were bored, and a bored knight usually meant a burnt village. They were dangerous to the peasantry, dangerous to the merchant, and most importantly to the Pope. They were dangerous to the church's remaining property. But the church at this time didn't have much of a military of its own. So what was the Pope to do? Well, they turned to that old tried and true method of elites everywhere. They brainwashed the knights. By the way, for a more detailed dive into honor codes and their development, check out my videos on that topic linked in the information card. Okay, so in the late 10th century, the church launched a series of movements called the Peace and Truce of God. They gathered the knights together and essentially made them swear on holy relics to stop hitting people who couldn't hit back, namely priests, merchants, and widows. But you can't just tell a warrior class, don't fight. Literally, it's what they're good at, and they need an outlet for those skills. So to be effective at controlling them, you have to give them someone new to fight. This is where we see the birth of sanctified violence. The church took the testosterone culture and pointed it outward. They rebranded the knight from a local enforcer to a soldier of Christ. The sword wasn't a tool for land grabs. No. It was a holy instrument. If you killed the enemies of the faith, you weren't a murderer, you were a candidate for heaven. Now, to make any rebranding stick, you need good stories. This era saw the rise of the chanson de geste, literally songs of heroic deeds. Composed a good century after the real events they're inspired by and performed by travelling jongleurs to the rhythmic strumming of a medieval fiddle, these songs were designed to pump up a crowd of knights before a campaign or entertain them by the fire and set their moral tone. The first that we know of is the Matter of France. These were the legendary tales of Charlemagne and his 12 peers, the Paladins. Side note, this is where we get the term Paladin from, long before the D&D class. Paladin actually means of the palace, and they were basically the final evolution of that Germanic comitatus I mentioned earlier, the elite inner circle bound to their lord by blood and oath. The most famous of these pieces of art in the Matter of France is the Song of Roland. This was apparently the centerpiece of a much larger Charlemagnean cinematic universe. Other songs and stories filled in the gaps in the narrative, giving Roland and his peers backstories and boyhood tales, supplying a legendary sword named Durandal, supposedly containing a tooth from St. Peter, and building soulmate rival stories like Roland's relationship with Oliver. There was even a prequel explaining how Roland was Charlemagne's secret nephew, and a spin-off about his best friend Oliver's sister, Aude. It was an entire shared mythology that created a Charlemagne fan fiction culture. Whether you were a knight in Spain or Poland, you heard about Roland and claimed those chivalric ideals for yourself. You weren't just a mercenary, you were a righteous warrior in the mold of the Paladins, whether or not you had a righteous bone in your body. The actual history those poems were based on is, of course, far messier. The poem depicts Roland's death as a massive holy war against the Saracens, but it's propaganda. In reality, the Battle of Roncesvalles in 778 AD wasn't a clash of civilizations. It was a disastrous tactical blunder. Charlemagne had actually been in Spain to help a Muslim faction in a civil war. When the campaign failed, his army retreated through the Pyrenees mountains. And as they moved through the narrow pass at Roncesvalles, it wasn't the Saracen army that hit them, it was the local Basque Christians. The Basques were furious because Charlemagne's retreating army had just leveled the walls of their capital, Pamplona. They used the high ground to ambush the rearguard, cutting them off in the forest and slaughtering them, including the real-life historical figure Rolandanus, Roland, the warden of Breton March. Charlemagne didn't stay to avenge them with divine miracles like in the poem. He kept riding for home. But 300 years later, when the Crusades began, that embarrassing mountain ambush was rebranded. The Basques were shopped out swapped out for the Saracens, the blunder became martyrdom, and the tactical defeat was transformed into the founding myth of Western chivalry. Look, I'm a cynic. If you're looking for an Arthurian fairy tale, well, I don't know what to tell you. However, what I can say is that the gap between propaganda and reality is where the best stories live. In A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, George R.R. Martin plays with this brilliantly. Duncan the Tall is a true believer. He believes it's a knight's duty to protect the weak. That is what he was taught. But then he encounters the Targaryen princes, men who use their knightly status as a license for cruelty, proving that the shining armor often hides a monster. Dunk finds himself in a world where being a true knight is actually pretty radical, because really it goes against the actual values of his class. And if you want to see what happens when sanctified violence goes horribly wrong, look at Judith Starr's work, particularly in The Golden Chain, where she dives into the messiness of the Fourth Crusade, specifically how that holy mandate can be used to justify atrocities. The Fourth Crusade was when the whole crusade got derailed and conquered Byzantium, a fellow Christian city, instead of going on to the Holy Land. On another side note, we'll be talking more about crusades later in the series as well. I won't focus too much on the Fourth here, as everybody knows about it, but if you do want an exploration of the Fourth Crusade, specifically how it could have gone differently, you should watch the channel Ultramere, where they do a great exploration of an alternate history of the Fourth Crusade. Okay, so how do we take these bloody bureaucratic origins and actually build a better fantasy world? When you're sitting down to design your own knightly orders, start with the money. Ask yourself these 3 questions. Who is signing the paychecks? If your knights aren't paid in gold, they're paid in power. Does your High King actually own the land, or has he franchised it out so much that his knights are more powerful than he is? If a knight loses their horse, are they out of a job? Or does the state provide a new tank, or do they need to make a new one from their own land? Remember, a knight without a fief is actually just a dangerous vagrant. Then, who pays the testosterone tax? If you have these elite warriors, where do they point their violence? Is there a piece of God to keep them from bullying the locals? Or do your knights have a holy war that they battle against? Then is your chivalry a hardware or a software? In your world, is knight a job description or a social class? Can a peasant like Dunk just find a suit of armor and claim the title, as in, can a knight make another knight? Or is knighthood more of a protector of the small situation, where the nobility has locked the doors and they keep the keys? You need to be noble to be a knight. In my opinion, it's more interesting when the code of honor is a weapon used by elites to keep outsiders out, but your mileage may vary. And now, while the awesome members of the channel scroll past, let me regale you with the sideways grandfather of the knights, the cataphracts. These were the elite heavy cavalry of powers like the Sarmatans, the Pantheons, and the Sassanins. Men and horses wrapped in layers of scale or laminar armor until they looked less like riders and more like moving fortresses. Their primary weapon was the kontos, a massive 2-handed lance often used in a full-on charge. Specialized saddles, disciplined formation, and sheer momentum let them hit with terrifying force despite the lack of stirrups. Which is why, despite the stirrup thesis, it's not all that in a bag of chips. The cataphracts' tactics weren't identical to later medieval cavalry tactics, but it was close enough to make the point. Heavy cavalry didn't suddenly appear in the Middle Ages. It had a long, deadly prehistory. The Romans learned this lesson the hard way, most famously at the Battle of Carrhae, where Parthian forces combining horse archers and armored cavalry dismantled a Roman army that was built to fight enemies who stood still and fought back on foot. But Rome being Rome, they did what they were famous for. They adapted. Especially in the later empire, Roman armies became more flexible and more cavalry heavy, incorporating their own version of armored horsemen, often called the clibanarii. While it's tempting to draw a straight line from the cataphracts to knights, history is once again more messier than that. The medieval knight wasn't copied from the East, so much as reinvented under different economic and political conditions. But the core idea, that of a heavily armored rider that could dominate the battlefield through speed and shock and staying power, that idea had already been proven centuries earlier, and it was simply made more by the invention of stirrup, lances, and high-cantled saddles. And that's exactly what we'll plunge into next time, the armor, equipment, and training of the knight. So make sure you're subscribed for that. If you made it this far, leave me a horse in the comments. And if you want to see more from me, check out my video on how to inherit a crown, and I will see you soon for another one. In most fantasy, a knight just exists. They show up on screen with shiny armor, the perfect seat in the saddle, and combat reflexes of a god, as if they were born in a plate mail onesie. But in the real Middle Ages, a knight was a fighting organism that took 21 years to grow. It was a process that started at age 7 with a wooden stick and ended at 21 with a ritual bath and a blessed blade. Today, we're diving into the training and gear of the medieval knight. We're looking at the grueling reality of the squire's grind, the high-tech cockpits we call saddles, and the brutal physics of the couched lance. But we're also looking at how fantasy staples like mithril, Valyrian steel, and combat magic impact the historical logic of the battlefield. Welcome to episode 2 of the series on knights by Just-in-Time Worldbuilding with your host, Marie Mullaney. Let's start by what it took to train a knight. Now listen, before we hit the rest of the section, let me just address one elephant in the room. Yes, it was possible for a soldier or even a commoner to be declared a knight by showing enormous courage and valor, and we'll talk about one of those examples later. Sure, it was possible, but it was super rare. And it's a little bit of propaganda. Like, sure, of course social mobility is possible, cupcake. Just do the super impossible thing and you too can be a knight. It's a bit like the Chinese Confucian exams. Sure, anyone can pass them and become a bureaucrat. But the reality is that you need time, tutors, and books to study, so in practice, it's mostly just the elite kids who get to become bureaucrats. Same with the knights. There were other ways to become a knight, but mostly they were well beyond the reach of anyone who didn't absolutely overflow with main character energy. Okay, so with that out the way, let's talk training. Knightly training started with becoming a page. A boy was normally sent away from his home at the age of 6 or 7 to serve as a page in another noble's home. This was done for 2 reasons. 1, it ensured the kid wasn't being treated softly by his own family, and 2, it built relationships between nobles that they could draw on later in life in order to build alliances. Pages who served together often were even closer than family, as we see in Song of Ice and Fire with Robert and Ned. Pages did a lot of menial labor. They looked after the horses, mucked out the stable, sharpened swords, served the dinner, even cleaned rooms in the castle. They also learned history and sometimes reading and writing. But they didn't really learn the fighting crafts yet. That only started when they turned 12 or 13 and they became squires. Before that, it was mostly just sticks and play. Now, squires spent the bulk of their time in armor, and they learned all about looking after knightly gear and the fighting arts. And squires were eventually, at the age of 21 or so, promoted to knights. By this time, they had proven to excel at all the skills a knight needed, most specifically what some have labeled the 7 points of agility, or septem probitus. And what are those, you ask? I'm so glad you did. First, riding and horsemanship and the lance. This was the absolute foundation, and it was way more than sitting on a horse. You had to be able to mount and dismount at a gallop, to control a temperamental stallion with only your knees and light hands on the reins. You had to maintain a perfect seat even when being struck by an opponent. You also had to learn to use a lance. That meant training with the thing until you were fantastic, including tilting at rings and the quintain. Speaking of the quintain, you've seen it in every movie, right? The knight hits a wooden shield on a swivel and a heavy sandbag swings around to clobber the knight if it's too slow. This part, that's nonsense. The modern TV dude, Jason, or the medieval TV dude, Jason, he tried to make this happen. He's practically begged the sandbag to hit him, and it's almost physically impossible. If you hit that shield with enough force to spin the arm, you're already well past the point of impact by the time the bag swings around. The quintain wasn't this dodge or die reflex test. It was just a target designed to teach you how to hit a stationary object with a lance without shattering your own arm or falling on your horse. It's a training tool, not a slapstick comedy prop. The reason why it had a weight attached to it was to train the squire in taking an impact when they hit the shield, not to smack them if they missed it or some such nonsense. Anyway, our second part of the 7 skill set is swimming and diving. We often hear the story that knights were terrified of water because of their armor, but this is pretty exaggerated. Historical training did emphasize swimming. It was a vital survival skill for crossing rivers during a campaign. And more importantly, doing this while wearing a padded gambeson or a partial mail even built incredible core strength and lung capacity. I do doubt that they swam in full armor, however. I think that part would kill you. Your third one was shooting and archery. Now, a knight was primarily a melee fighter, do not get me wrong, but they were expected to be reasonably proficient with missile weapons, including maybe the crossbow or the hunting bow or some such. And they also had to know how to defend against these weapons, including darts and throwing spears and so on. Your fourth skill is climbing. Squires practiced climbing walls, ladders, and even ropes, again, often while wearing their armor. This was preparation for siege warfare. If you were the first man over the battlements, you needed the upper body strength to haul yourself up while people were throwing rocks and boiling oil at your head, and you needed to do it while wearing the 25 kilos worth of armor. 5 is fencing and swordsmanship. I mean, of course. This was an incredibly technical skill. It involved mastering the longsword, the arming sword, and the buckler. Knights didn't just hack at each other. They needed to understand leverage and timing, binding another person's blade, footwork, all of the elements of fencing. Fencing is basically a high-speed chess match played with steel. Our sixth skill is wrestling and grappling. In actual knightly combat, if you didn't kill your opponent in the first pass of the lance, you usually ended up rolling around on the ground. Wrestling was essential for finding the gaps in an opponent's plate armor and using your dagger, the Misericordiae, to finish the fight. Most medieval fighting manuals, like Vechtbrugger and the like, spend as much time on wrestling as they do on swords. And our seventh skill was courtly arts, which is dancing and etiquette. This is a point people often overlook. A knight was a member of the social elite. Dancing was used to prove that the warrior had grace and poise and endurance. If you could dance a complex athletic set for an hour in a heated hall after a day of hunting, You had the wind and the footwork necessary for a long battle, as well as having the etiquette to conduct yourself with grace and poise in the king's court. If you look at these 7 points of agility, it becomes clear that the knight was not just a warrior. The knight was a professional athlete and an elite citizen of a polity. And learning all of these skills took one heck of a strain on these kids. We see the sheer physical toll of this kind of training perfectly captured in Tamora Pierce's Tortall books, specifically Alana, the First Adventure. Pierce nails the reality that you can't just be a knight. You have to rewire your entire musculoskeletal system. Alana is constantly exhausted, bruising her ribs and pushing through the pain just barely cope with a day's work as a page. And Pierce also adds the fantasy factor of magic. Alana isn't just training her body, she's also training her gift of magic, which is where fantasy world building gets very interesting. In the real world, the squire's education was purely physical and social. In a fantasy world, the elite must also navigate the potential for magic. How do knights cope with it? In my world, all my knights are also competent in magic. But you don't have to go this route. Knights could be equipped with magic items, which could be capable of turning magic aside. Or a knight could be assigned to a mage, and the mage deals with magic while the knight does the fighting. All of these offer very interesting storytelling opportunities. Back in Tortall, Alana learns the basics of magic, but only the very basics. When the king's brother, Roger, plots to claim the throne, he represents the danger of a knightly class that doesn't just have the monopoly on physical violence, but on metaphysical violence too. And Roger very nearly succeeds in his coup. So, if you're creating a knight equivalent class in your world, consider if magic replaces the need for physical stamina or training, or maybe it adds to it. Would a warrior be better suited to learn to throw fireballs or tilt at the quintain? Or is it a case of learning both, though neither with the skill of a true specialist? And what skills does your squire have to demonstrate in order to become a knight at all? Does that skill include magic? And for help in creating magic items that can support your knights in the field, let me briefly plug Worldbuilding Blueprints Volume 1, which you can buy in PDF or EPUB on my website right now. Possibly also the physical copies. The Kickstarter should be fulfilled by the time this video goes live. The book has a whole chapter about building out your magic system, including magic items of various types and even artifacts. And this isn't just theory. There are exercises, examples, worksheets, and some truly gorgeous art, even in the black and white paperback. And I'll throw in a discount if you use the code NIGHT2026, all caps. There is a 20% discount on all digital books on my website. Links to that down below. Now, let's get back to knights. A knight's life was filled with ritual, especially in the transitions from page to squire to knight, and most especially that last one. We'll unpack them and talk about what it was like in both history and how Tamora Pierce adapted those transition rituals in Tortall. By the way, I did a video a while ago about the importance of ritual, if you want to check that out in the information card. Okay, so we start with the page. This wasn't a formal ritual in the way that, say, knighthood was, but it's a very definitive cliff edge end to childhood. The page's life was defined by the transition from domestic care to an apprenticeship of service. They move away from home and they need to become way more grown up in their new role. The next step is transitioning from page to squire. In our world and our history, that meant the squire was now wearing armor and perhaps serving a specific knight. The squire might also actually participate in fighting and would focus on learning the fighting arts. In Tortal, there's an interesting story here. It used to be that pages became squires without much fuss, but after Alana made it through the whole page training period while pretending to be a boy, the kingdom instituted public tests that everyone could witness, where the pages had to prove they were worthy and ready to be squires. Also in Tortal, there's a choosing element here. A knight had to choose a page to be his squire, and generally all pages are chosen by an existing knight. Finally, we come to the big one, the ritual to go from squire to knight. In our world, this typically occurred at the age of 21, though it could happen earlier for extraordinary acts of valor or during times of war. There was a massive ritual around this. On the evening of the ceremony, the candidate would take a ritual bath to symbolically wash away his sins. He would then dress in white clothes and a red cloak, and he spent the entire night kneeling in prayer before an altar upon which his weapons were laid. The ceremony was usually held during great religious feasts like Christmas or Easter, or at royal weddings. It often involved a mass in the chapel with an audience of knights and ladies. A priest or bishop would bless the candidate's sword and fasten it around his waist, a process known as girding. The candidate took a formal oath to fight against wrongdoers and protect the weak, including widows, orphans, and the poor. And then we come to the final defining ritual, the dubbing. The candidate knelt before his lord or a priest, who would tap or dub him on the shoulders or cheek with a sword. Historically, this was the only blow a knight was required to take without fighting back. And finally, the candidate was presented with golden spurs in the later parts of knighthood, which were attached to his heels as a final mark of his new status. In the legendary case of Ogier the Dane, who was part of the Song of Roland, he was knighted with a sword Cortana, which was inscribed to show its relationship to Roland's magical sword Durendal. Following the ceremony, wealthy households would celebrate with feasting and tournaments that could last for several days. Now, Tamora Pierce used much the same ritual, but she added a magic twist: the chamber of the ordeal. This was a room where knights entered after the night spent in prayer, and they faced in there something which would test their honor. If the chamber found them worthy, they came out and were accepted as knights. If not, well, the chamber had been known to kill. So it was kind of an independent final examiner. How would you do it? What magic from your world would impact on the knight ceremony? Now, before we move on, here's a quick quiz for you. What order is the knight career path in? Okay, let's talk equipment. As I said, one of the skills a page had to learn was looking after horses. And given how important horses are to knights, I think it's only fair that we spend a bit of time talking about them. If the knight is a tank, the horse is half the weapon. We tend to imagine all medieval horses were these massive, slow-moving shires, but that's actually just another myth. In reality, the knight's stable was a pretty specialized toolkit. First you had the destrier. This was the actual warhorse, although, strictly speaking, it was technically mostly rode in jousting, but we'll get to that. Anyway, the warhorse was the destrier was chosen for explosive power and aggression. European knights mostly preferred stallions trained to charge without flinching. Now, I'm gonna be real with you. Horses are skittish animals. War horses required a ton of training to get them to ride into battle and not shy away from the lights, the noise, and the danger. Trainers would clash shields, blow trumpets, and even light small fires near the folds to get them used to the chaos of war. Heck, true war horses were trained to be active in combat, biting and kicking and trampling anyone in front of them. The thing about the destrier, though, is that it was quite rare and, as I say, mostly used in jousts, because coursers were the preferred war horse to be used in other areas. And this is for a couple of reasons. First, the destrier was obscenely expensive, and risking it in warfare was putting a lot of money on the table. Kind of like leaving an AWACS plane parked in the open in the age of drones. Anyway, second, coursers were agile, had more endurance, and were more controllable. See, a destrier is a stallion, and those buggers are exhausting to ride. And if they smell a mare, well, good luck with controlling that. Anyway, finally, knights also typically had a palfrey. You didn't ride your expensive high-strung destrier or even your courser to battle. You'd be exhausted before you got there just from controlling the horse, and the horse would be exhausted from carrying you. Instead, you rode your palfrey, a horse with a smooth, ambling gait that wouldn't jar your bones over a 20-mile trek. But the horse is only as good as the connection to the rider, and this is where the war saddle comes in. This was one of the great technological innovations that really made knights absolute monsters on the battlefield. It featured a high front bow and a high rear cantle, effectively locking the knight into place on the back of the horse. When that lance hit an opponent, the force didn't just push against the knight's arm. It pushed against the back of the saddle, which transferred the kinetic energy directly into the horse's 1,000-pound frame. And if you combine that with a rigid steel stirrup, you get immense lateral stability. The stirrup allowed the knight to stand up to deliver a massive downward blow or lean out of the saddle without slipping. And to keep this entire fighting organism moving, we have the nailed horseshoe. Yeah, I'm not kidding. The horseshoe's a technological innovation. Horseshoes are more than just lucky. They're critical to the knight. Before the 11th century, horseshoes were much rarer, and they were basically just tied on rather than nailed. The invention of the nailed shoe allowed horses to gallop over the rocky, wet terrain of northern Europe without risking their hooves. Without that bit of iron, your heavy cavalry is one misstep away from being sidelined with a bruised toe. So, that's all the critical equipment the horse needed. But that was by no means the only equipment for the horse. By the 14th century, the horse was as well protected as the man, and we call horse armor barding. It starts with mail crinets for the neck, and then evolved into plate chaffrons for the head and flancards for the flank. Okay, now let's break physics again. Of course, you can have a horse as the knight's mount, and there's nothing wrong with a good old classic. But this is also where many writers veer into fantasy. You can have mechanical horses in a futuristic setting. Dragons, of course, are a classic. Pegasi could be a great fun twist. Or giant snakes. I'm quite partial to giant snakes. In all cases, what you want to consider is, how does the knight stay on its mount? What is the equivalent of the war saddle and the stirrup? Second, what protects the mount as it is slithering along stones? What's the equivalent of the nailed horseshoe? And third, how about in battle? Does the mount have any kind of armor? This is especially important to consider with flying mounts. Remember, those puppies are going to struggle to fly if you load them down with steel. So what do Pegasi and dragons and the like do for armor? And speaking of armor, when we talk about knightly equipment, we are talking about a multi-century technological arms race between the weaponsmith and the armorsmith. As one side improves, the other side catches up, over and over again, until finally, gunpowder ends the knight's reign. But let's not start at the depressing end. In the 11th century, the gold standard in armor was the hauberk, a knee-length shirt of thousands of interlinked iron rings called mail. Mail was a miracle of its time. It was flexible, it was relatively breathable, and almost impossible to cut with a sword. However, it had a fatal flaw. It was a soft defense. If a mace hit you, the mail didn't break, but your ribs did. This necessitated the accaton or gambeson, a heavy quilted undergarment that acted like a modern ballistic vest to absorb blunt force trauma from those weapons. As the centuries rolled on, swords got bigger and crossbows got stronger, and so armor got more and more plates on top of their mail. By the 13th century, knights began riveting iron plates on the inside of their surcoats, the coat of plates. By the 1400s, this had evolved into the iconic white armor or full plate. Full plate is way more than just a tin can, and nothing illustrates this better than the pig-faced bassinet helmet. While this looks bizarre to our modern eyes, that exaggerated conical snout is actually a lifesaver. The geometry was strictly functional. By creating a sharp, protruding point, the armorer ensured that a lance tip or sword thrust would hit a glancing surface. Instead of the full kinetic energy of a charge punching through the steel, the blow would slide off to the side. Furthermore, the snout provided a larger internal cavity, creating a crucial air pocket that allowed the knight to breathe more easily during the frantic oxygen-depleted struggle of a melee, all while keeping the actual breathing holes far enough away from the face to prevent a dagger from finding a lucky entry point. Also, on a side note, the idea that armor was impossible to move in is false. Sure, you're not as agile as a person not wearing armor, but squires did everything, including climbing ladders in armor. They learned to compensate for the weight and the movement restrictions. Obviously, this took training and time. You're not going to put on a suit of armor and be super agile, but that's what training and time were for. Now, to cover the basics, here's what armor is called. Helmet on the head, bevier or gorget on the throat, pauldrons on the shoulder, rebrace, counter, vambrace, gauntlet on the arms, cuirass, placard, folds on the chest, cuisses, pollain, greaves, and sabotons on the legs. And that's the suit. So obviously, this type of armor wasn't made by the bloke down the road. High-end armor was a massive industrial undertaking. You had Harsing Fegers and specialized guilds of plate makers in centers like Milan or Augsburg. A single suit of plate was the medieval equivalent of a Ferrari, custom fitted, articulated at every joint, and polished to a mirror sheen to prevent rust. On the other side of the arms race is, of course, the weapons. On the charge, the couched lance was the king of the field. By the 12th century, knights started couching their lances, which is to say, tucking the wooden shaft under the armpit. Combined with a lance rest, a metal hook bolted onto the breastplate, this locked the lance to the knight's entire body mass. When that lance point hit, it hit with 1,500 pounds of horse and rider, smashing into the square inch. And that's the way you should smash that like button. Lord, that was terrible. Anyway, hit the like button and hype while you're down there. If the lance shattered, the knight drew his sword, but as plate armor got better, the sword had to change. The classic double-edged arming sword gave way to the estoc, a stiff needle-pointed blade designed specifically to find the gaps in armor. The armpits, the visor, the groin. But if you couldn't find a gap, you could try to break the shell. The mace and the warhammer became essential. A flanged mace didn't need to cut the armor. It needed to transmit enough kinetic energy to cause a concussion or shatter a bone through the steel. Late period knights also favored the poleaxe for dismounted combat. This is a pretty terrifying 4-in-1 weapon that features an axe for chopping, a hammer for crushing, and spikes on both ends for thrusting. And of course, we gotta talk about ranged weapons. Listen, I know, everyone loves a sword, I do myself. But here's the truth. Humans have evolved to throw stuff. We have the best throwing arms in all the world. Our whole motion of throwing is pretty damn unique. And ranged weapons are just a way to throw stuff better. The crossbow was a pretty great way to throw quarrels, which is what you call a crossbow bolt. Using a crankwin, a mechanical geared crank, a commoner with about 2 weeks of training could span a steel bow that could give a knight one heck of a bad time, especially if the knight was wearing cheaper armor. It was so effective and so dishonorable that the Second Lateran Council actually tried to ban the crossbow. It represents the first crack in the knight's monopoly on violence. Of course, the real crack comes with firearms. We were just talking about how expensive it was to train knights. Well, once you had smooth bore guns like the arquebus and whatnot, you could take a peasant, train him in the basics, line him up in a square, and as the knights charge across the battlefield, what do you get? You get dead knights. We like to think that we invent these things, but asymmetric warfare has always been with us. It just means that we have a cheap war unit that can take out an expensive war unit. Not that all knights everywhere keeled over dead once guns appeared on the scene, don't misunderstand me. It took decades, maybe even as much as 100 years, before the institution of knighthood actually faded. But let's leave such depressing conversations behind and talk about spicy world building. That is to say, where fantasy enters the scene. In history, the quality of your steel was limited by the purity of your ore and the heat of your forge. In fantasy, we have mithril, adamant, Valyrian steel, and whatever else you can think of. I made a video about metals in fantasy, which you can check out in the information card. Now, bear in mind, if you introduce a metal that is half the weight and twice as strong as steel, you really change the tactics of the knight. A knight in full plate is agile, but they do have a stamina clock. If mithril armor weighs as much as a silk shirt, your knights upgrade from tanks to Olympic sprinters wearing mesh armor. They don't need horses to cross the battlefield, they can outrun your infantry at that point. The same applies to weapons. If a sword is enchanted to never dull, the specialized guild of sword polishers goes out of business. If a shield can magically absorb kinetic energy, the high-backed saddle becomes less important because the rider isn't being kicked back by the impact. And if you have mages who can throw fireballs, well, you either need magic armor or very costly magic, or you're back to asymmetric warfare and a whole bunch of dead knights. Long story short, a knight's equipment is very worth thinking about. Indeed, it can be way more than just gear. Elizabeth Moon's The Deeds of Paxenorion is perhaps the best example of equipment as character development. Moon, being a former Marine, understands that gear is a burden before it's a benefit. We see Pax start as a recruit in Duke Felon's company. Her equipment is pretty utilitarian. It's a leather jack, a basic sword, and a heavy pack. We feel every mile of the march and every strap that chafes. And as Paxenorion grows, her gear evolves with her status. When she eventually receives her Paladin's gear, we've seen her work for every piece of plate and every sword. Moon also highlights something crucial: maintenance. Pax spends hours cleaning her mail and sharpening her blade. In the Rihanna universe by Judith Tarr, we see a similar focus on the professionalism of the warrior. It's not about the magic of the sword. It's about the fact that the knight knows exactly how to use the weight of that sword to find the gap in the armor. So when you're writing in your world, don't stop at making a magic sword +1 that just hits harder. Create a blade that was forged by a specific guild, that requires a specific oil to keep from rusting, and that weighs enough that the knight's wrist aches after a day of practice. That way, your weapons will feel real. Now, while the epic members of the channel scroll by, let's talk about sword makers. In our world, high-end gear came from massive production centers like Passau, Solingen, and Nuremberg. What's really cool is that they actually did mark their blades. Yes, swordmaker marks were absolutely real. If you saw the running wolf stamp of a Passau blade, you knew you were holding the finest steel in Europe. A mark so prestigious it's been found on swords from London to Gdansk. Even the Grand Masters of the Teutonic Order wouldn't settle for local knockoffs. Records show them paying massive sums, over 12 marks, just to have their mail hauberks imported from the master workshops of Nuremberg. We even have some of the names of the smiths that have survived in the ledgers through the years, like Master Jacob the armourer or Peter Bogener the crossbow maker, and through them we see a world of extreme specialization. A knight didn't just go to a smith, he dealt with a swartverger to polish and sharpen his blade, a harsingveger to assemble his plate, and kisten makers and settlers, carpenters and saddlers to build his shield. It was a fragmented assembly line of experts. This level of guild-driven perfection is exactly what we're reaching for in fantasy when we talk about Valerian steel or the smiths of Nogrod. In your own world building, it's worth thinking about such master craftsmen's places. It's historical, it's fun, and it's even more valid in the case of magical items. Because at the end of the day, a knight is only as good as the guy who spent 10 hours polishing his visor. If you believe the legends, a knight's life was an endless loop of slaying dragons, rescuing royals, and finding magic fountains. We call this the knight errant, the wandering hero on a mystical quest. But in the real Middle Ages, if a knight told you he was on a quest, he didn't mean he was looking for the Holy Grail. He meant his boss sent him 20 miles down the road to make sure a bridge wasn't falling down, or to forcibly repossess a neighbor's cows. Today, we're looking into the professional life of the knight, from the boredom of the estate management to the sanctified violence of the Crusades. Welcome to episode 3 of the series of On Knights by Just in Time Worldbuilding with your host, Marie Mullaney. Questing is the heart of the Matter of Britain and the Matter of France, the two great literacy cycles of the Middle Ages. In these stories, figures like Lancelot or Roland go on quests. They encounter giants, enchanted castles, and holy relics. This obviously wasn't real. Historical quests were, generally speaking, expeditions or diplomatic assignments. You might be sent to escort a highborn lady, a la William Marshall, who escorted Eleanor of Aquitaine, with great success for him in the end of the day. Anyway, you could also be delivering a sensitive message through enemy territory or scouting a specific mountain pass. While a squire could be knighted early for distinguishing himself on an important quest, again see William Marshall, this was a reward for military professionalism, not for fighting a supernatural beast. But why were quests used in these stories of chivalric honor then? In medieval literature and in the culture, the quest served a multifaceted purpose for the knight's story. They acted as a vehicle for exploring societal values, they were a grueling trial for the individual hero, and a quest represented an essential plot device to drive the narrative forward. A lot like it does in our world. So, let's unpack those three purposes. First, demonstrating societal and chivalric values. Quests were designed to showcase the ideals of the perfect Christian warrior. In literary cycles like The Matter of France and The Matter of Britain, the quest provided the stage for the knight to prove his prowess, loyalty, and faith. Legendary figures like Roland and Orlando embodied master passions such as daring and an exaggerated conception of honor. The quest forced these characters to choose between conflicting duties, such as loyalty to a lord versus service of a lady, thereby exploring the ideals and anxieties of the elite class. Basically, the quest forced internal conflict. Also, as the church integrated itself into the knightly class, quests often took on a spiritual dimension. Missions to retrieve holy relics, like those in the tales of Feudalism or the quest of the Holy Grail, reframed martial prowess as a religious vocation, where the knight was a miles Christi, a soldier of Christ. This showed what society, aka the church, wanted and expected knights to be. The second purpose of questing is the journey as a trial of a character. The journey aspect of a quest was rarely a simple travelogue. It was a test of stamina and moral fiber. In epics like Orlando Furioso, the journey takes the hero across the entire world, and even to the moon, to recover his lost wits, demonstrating that the quest is a process of internal refinement as much as external achievement. The physical journey involved encountering monsters, terrific as they appeared, and magical traps, which tested a knight's ability to remain good and true even when stripped of his standard weaponry. These trials serve to differentiate true knights from mere men-at-arms. So basically, your external conflict and some internal conflict. And then finally, we have quests as a plot device. From a narrative perspective, the quest was a vital engine for storytelling, allowing authors to transition from historical chronicles to fantastical romances. Historically, as I said earlier, an important quest or mission was often a specific tactical assignment. But in literature, this was expanded into episodic adventures that allowed characters to meet giants and enchanters and magic fountains. As the genre of questing knights matured, fantasy elements became way more common, transforming quests into wish fulfillment fantasy for the medieval audience. This allowed authors to explore themes of human potential that were otherwise repressed by the rigid historical reality of warfare. In addition, narrative quests often acted as a way to resolve the apparent paradoxes of chivalric violence and Christian forgiveness by channeling that violence towards sanctified or righteous ends. Basically, quests helped people make sense of the contradictions in their culture. And it is an outgrowth of this questing literature that gives us many knight-based fantasies today. In The Woman Who Rides Like a Man by Tamora Pierce, Alana of Trabond embarks on a quest to find the Dominion Jewel. In Lioness Rampart, she actually goes on a quest to find the Dominion Jewel and hand it over to her king, Jonathan. The jewel is basically a magical thigamy, that's a technical term, that boosts the mage's elemental power. But the thigamy is not really the point of the quest. The point is Alana facing her fears of magic, climbing the mountain, finding the jewel, and then, like a loyal liegeman, handing the jewel over to her king. You know what the problem is with reading a lot of philosophy? I read so much for meaning that it almost becomes too much. I love the Alana story. It's a great story. But the Dominion jewel bit is where she gives it to Jonathan and he holds off Roger's coup with it and he saves the kingdom. It feels very much like a support of hierarchies. I don't think Tamora Pierce wrote it to be that precisely, but after 14,000 years of these kinds of myths, we all have this ingrained like, yes, hierarchy is good actually. And loyalty to our liege is good actually. You know, it takes actual work to break from that. Anyway, rabbit hole older. When you're doing your world building, consider what the quest means, not just for the knight, but also for the society. Is it a mystical calling or just a high stakes military objective? So that's it, right? The wandering knight without a home is a lie. Well, not exactly. Questing may have been a literary device, but knights traveling from tournament to tournament is 100% true. Tournaments started as training for war with the melee. Imagine hundreds of knights in full gear divided into teams called conroys, charging at each other across miles of open countryside. The fight here didn't stay in a ring. They fought all over the place. It was a chaotic free-for-all brawl designed to test unit cohesion and stamina. This was not yet a sport. It's actually just an extension of training. But as the centuries passed, this evolved into the joust, which is an ultimate high-speed collision sport. Two knights, locked into their high-bowed saddles, charge at each other with the goal of either breaking a lance or physically catapulting the other man out of his seat. By the time of Edward III, these were high fashion events of the century, featuring feasting and dancing and elite stars of the show. Remember in episode 1 how I spoke about the ransom culture and paying for warfare? That 100% applies to jousts. If you lost, the rules were simple. You forfeited your horse and your armor to the victor. Given that a full panoply cost as much as a small farm, a single loss could bankrupt a knight. On the other hand, to the victor go the spoils, baby. And the real-world poster child for that is Sir William Marshall. He started as a landless younger son, basically a hedge knight with nothing but his gear and his skill. He hit the tournament circuit, captured hundreds of knights for ransom, and used that ready cash to build a fortune. He ended his life as Earl of Pembroke and one of the most powerful men in England. Now I will say, this wasn't just through the tournament circle. William Marshall was the GOAT of knights. And I have done a little short series about him, which you can check out when it comes out for his life. So for all you Marshall fans out there, go check that out to see my take on him. It is worth mentioning that by the late Middle Ages, jousting equipment had become so specialized that it was actually not really that great for a real battlefield. A knight in a tournament was outfitted more like a driver in a demolition derby than a soldier. Jousting armor was significantly heavier than field armor. The helmets were often bolted directly to the breastplate so your head wouldn't snap back from whiplash. And the left side of the armor, the side taking the hilt, was reinforced with extra steel plates, making it heavier. Even the horses were specialized, as I said in our equipment video. The destrier was great at jousting, but knights didn't often ride them into actual war. Instead, they rode coursers who had stamina and often weren't stallions, because stallions take a hell of an effort to control. We see all this play out in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, the new HBO show inspired by George R. Martin's Dunk and Egg stories. Dunk is a hedge knight who has inherited his old knight master's gear and horses, and now he's competing in a tourney, but by doing so, he risks the only things of values that he has. Martin's Duncan egg stories are some of the best knighthood stories out there if you want realism. And the HBO adaptation is done very well. So if what you're looking for is like, how did medieval knights live? It's worth checking that out. It's very historically accurate in an inspired by way. Now, before we delve into the Crusades and different orders, give me one moment to invite you to sign up for my newsletter. It comes out 4 times a year, and it's not just a collection of videos I like. It includes original content about world building, an update on my writing project and my thoughts on writing, a deep dive into a topic via a blog post, and more. Also, all subscribers get a free novella every year, and you get to ask questions which I will answer. So follow the link down below and sign up for Marie's Deep Thoughts and get your free ebook today. And now, let's return to your scheduled programming. We need to address one of the biggest misconceptions about medieval warfare. It wasn't a series of glorious open field battles. In fact, most commanders viewed a pitched battle as a catastrophic gamble. If you lost your knights, you lost your capital, your defense, and your governance in a single afternoon. The historical reality of a war for a knight was usually much more tedious and much more cruel. It was defined by the siege and the harrying. If you wanted to defeat a rival lord, you burnt his crops, slaughtered his livestock, and terrorized his peasants. This was a deliberate political tactic called chevauchée. By destroying the fief, you proved the enemy lord couldn't fulfill his half of the feudal contract to his peasant. Protection. Remember, feudalism is a bargain. The warrior is supposed to protect the peasant, and if you can't do that, your peasants start turning against you. This was bloody, sweaty, muscular work, and it took place in the mud of the village, not the gold of the court. And warfare was endemic. In 7th century England, the kingdom of Mercia was at war with its neighbours every 5 or 6 years. It was in a constant state of low-level border raiding. When a real battle did happen, it was grinding and claustrophobic wrestling match with 50 pounds of steel, where the goal was to find a gap in a visor and shove a dagger through it. But then, everything changed. In the 7th century, the Rashidun Caliphate had conquered Jerusalem, but they mostly left Christian and Jewish populations alone. That changed with the Seljuk Empire in the 11th century and the Byzantines' request for help in retaking the Holy Land. This was the moment the church successfully hijacked the knightly class. Before the Crusades, the church generally viewed soldiers as necessary evils at best and murderers at worst. But by reframing the recapture of Jerusalem as a holy quest, they created the Miles Christi, the soldier of Christ. Fighting in a crusade was reframed as a form of penance. If you were a knight who had spent your life bullying peasants and raiding neighbors, you could wash away those sins by killing the right people in the Holy Land. This sanctified violence turned the knight into a religious icon. It also introduced a massive cultural exchange. Knights returned to Europe with new ideas in architecture and medicine and mathematics, and a newfound, if often hypocritical, emphasis on the virtue of charity. The rise of the military orders was perhaps the most radical pivot in the history of the church. It created that walking paradox, the soldier monk. These men took the standard monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but instead of spending their days copying manuscripts, they spent their days practicing with a couched lance. They were one of the professional standing armies that Europe had rarely seen since the legions of Rome had vanished, and they were born out of necessity. Each order grew from a specific need created by the Crusades. Let's explore them, starting with the Knights Templar. Founded around 1119, the Poor Knights of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon were the special forces of the crusade. Their original purpose was pretty narrow and dangerous. They were supposed to protect the Christian pilgrims traveling the bandit-ridden roads from the coast of Jaffa to the holy sites in Jerusalem. Because they were headquartered on the Temple Mount, they took the name Templars. Yes, naming really does work like that. You do not need to be real special with your names. Anyway, they eventually became the international bankers of the era, but their core identity was always the elite heavy cavalry. If a Crusader king needed a hole punched in a Saracen line, he called the Templars. Our second order is the Knights Hospitaller, or the Medics, and they were formed even before the First Crusade, the Order of Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, and they began as a charitable organization. Their founding mission was to provide medical care and hospitality, hence the name, to poor, sick, or injured pilgrims. However, as the Holy Land became a permanent war zone, the medics realized they couldn't heal people if those same medics were all being slaughtered. They militarized to defend their hospitals and eventually became a naval powerhouse, a tradition they carried all the way to their later incarnation as the Knights of Malta, an organization that still exists. Our third order is the Teutonic Knights, or the frontier colonizers. These guys were a bit late to the party, and they were the Order of Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem. They were founded during the Third Crusade, 1190. Like the Hospitallers, they started with a hospital, specifically for German-speaking pilgrims, but they quickly evolved into a military juggernaut. When things went south in the Levant, they pivoted their focus to the Northern Crusades. Yes, those were absolutely a thing, and carved out a massive monastic state in Prussia and the Baltics. These guys were state builders and colonizers who brought the franchise model of knighthood to the edge of the known world. So far, this has been an absolute sausage fest. It's just been men all the way through. So, were women completely uninvolved in historical knighthood? Well, let's talk about that. When we think of the Crusades and the military orders, we tend to imagine a strictly monastic, all-male brotherhood. But history is rarely that clean-cut. While the frontline monk tank was the standard image of a man in armor, women were a persistent and functional part of the knightly ecosystem. In the Hospitallers and the Teutonic Knights, you had the consorores or seers hospitallars, sisters who took vows and managed the hospital part of the order. They weren't background characters, they were the logistical and medical backbone of the Crusader states, performing surgery, managing estates, and providing the hospitality that gave those orders their names. However, as the Middle Ages progressed and the tournament culture became a high-fashion spectacle, we see women entering the ranks of honorific orders. I stress the honorific part. These were not frontline combat roles, but they were formal recognitions of status and merit. The Order of the Garter, founded by Edward III, admitted 68 ladies of the Garter between the 14th and 15th century. In the Low Countries, orders were founded by noblewomen like Catherine Parr that granted titles like Chevaliere, the female form of Chevalier, or Equitassa. These women held rank in their own right, reflecting a world where the noblewomen often had to act as military commanders of their own castles, especially while their husbands were away at war, or if their husbands had died, leaving them holding the military title, or perhaps for their sons who were still children. That role as defender of the home played out in a spectacular fashion with the Order of the Hatchet. In 1149, the city of Tortosa in Catalonia was under a Moorish siege. The Second Crusade was draining the region of men, and the local noble was on the verge of surrendering the city. The women of Tortosa looked at the prospect of surrender and instead chose violence. They dressed in men's clothing, armed themselves with whatever was at hand. Legend says they used many hatchets, and they launched a resolute sally, breaking the siege of the Moors. Count Raymond Berenger IV was so struck by their bravery, he did something unprecedented. He knighted all of them. These women became the Equitessa and Militessa, female knights with specific legally binding privileges that would make any male knight jealous. First, in all public meetings and assemblies, the women of the hatchet were granted precedence over men. They literally walked into the room first. They were granted a total exemption from all taxes, a reward usually reserved for the highest military elites. And they were given the legal right to own all apparel and jewels left to them by their husbands, regardless of value. A massive win for these women. Now, I will say that this was a once-off event, and there is some argument about how much of it is true and how much of it is apocryphal. But either way, no other women were admitted into the Order of the Hatchet besides these women who were involved in the defense of Tortosa, and it became defunct when the last member died. But it doesn't have to be that way in your world. In your world, the Order of the Hatchet, or its equivalent, could very well survive, admitting a small number of women who do serve on the battlefield, even in low fantasy settings. Now, as we roll the credits for our Epic Channel members, let's talk about my favorite bit of medieval malicious compliance, the Sixth Crusade. If you think a crusade requires the Pope's blessing, an army of fanatical peasants, and a lot of dead people, Frederick II wants a word. Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of Sicily, which is an odd combination if you ask me, was a man the Pope essentially treated like a recurring villain. He was brilliant. He spoke Arabic, he kept the harem, and he was perpetually excommunicated by the Pope. In 1227, the Pope excommunicated Frederick for not going on crusade. When Frederick finally set sail in 1228, the Pope excommunicated him again for going on crusade while being excommunicated. So Frederick arrives in the Holy Land as a literal outlaw of the church, but he's on crusade. The military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers and so on, were in a total flat panic about this. Like, what do you even do with this guy? You're not supposed to even talk to an excommunicated leader, but he's here on crusade, which is what your orders are founded to be about, right? But Frederick didn't really care about the whole sanctified violence angle. He cared about results. So instead of launching a bloody siege, he sat down and started writing letters to the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil. And the two of them really hit it off. They traded gifts, they discussed philosophy and science in Arabic, and they realized they both had bigger problems at home than they had with each other. In 1229, they signed the Treaty of Jaffa. Without a single major battle, Frederick negotiated the return of Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Bethlehem to Christian control. The church, of course, hated it. Because the treaty allowed Muslims to keep control of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Patriarch of Jerusalem put the entire city under interdict, effectively banning God from the holy city because Frederick had won it the wrong way. When Frederick went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to be crowned King of Jerusalem, no priest would touch him. So, what did he do? Picked up the crown and plopped it on his very own head. I love the Sixth Crusade. It's just so ridiculous. Frederick II was a soldier of Christ, while the Vicar of Christ was actively trying to invade his home kingdom of Sicily. And despite Frederick winning everything the church really needed, It wasn't what they wanted, so it wasn't good enough. It's all sheer pettiness, and I am here for it.
You have insulted my honor, sir, and I demand redress. Well, not you personally. I mean, I'd probably lose if I actually fought you. But it is the topic of today's video. Honor codes, what they offer you as a fantasy world builder, how to make them, how to break them. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. If this kind of topic interests you and you'd like to help me keep making these videos, you can hit my Ko-fi page or buy my books, links down below. Okay, let's get cracking. First, what is honor? So, at a very high level, honor can be defined as your value to society. It generally comes down to a set of codes that define how you should behave given a certain class or a certain set of skills that you hold. Often, this kind of honor-based society results in very intricate and stratified class levels and very intricate and stratified shows of respects. How deep you bow to people, how do you establish rank, how do you greet a superior, how do you greet an inferior, how do you say goodbye to people, even something as simple as giving gifts to each other and whether you can accept a gift or whether you can even offer a gift to somebody else. Honor often results also in shame being a thing in your society. Now, it is important to understand the difference here between shame and guilt. Guilt is when the law establishes that you are guilty of something. But shame is a much more subtle thing because you might not be guilty of one specific thing. You might be ashamed because you have failed your society. You have failed the tenets of your honor code. And your society might very well enforce that shame by putting pressure on you to behave in the way that the society expects you to behave in a way that garners honor. And that shame can be weaponized. The best way that I've seen that demonstrated is in Catherine Kerr's books, which are set in a sort of Celtic-inspired world. And in this world, you have bards who have basically freedom of speech in order to protect the people from lords who go too far. And these bards can create what are called flyting songs. Now, these flyting songs are basically satirical lambasements of a noble. So, for example, in one of her books, there's a noble called Otto who is not as generous as he should be. And there's a bard who crafts this flyting song about how Otto is such a miser that he even steals from his own peasants. And at one point, Otto does something that makes the king very angry, and the king gets the bard to stand up and sing this song in the great hall before all the people. And this causes Otto such shame that he actually starts plotting that bard's downfall, which is actually against the laws of Devery. If you harm a bard, you're hanged for it. So you can definitely weaponize shame in that fashion. And in fact, in the latest books by Catherine Kerr, The Sword of Fire, the book opens with a bard starving themselves to death on the steps of a lord's castle in protest to the lord ignoring flyting songs and ignoring the justice that the lord is supposed to bring to the people. And that kind of action also comes from our world. People have done it in the past, but it is actually where seppuku originated from. The Japanese tradition of killing yourself actually originated as a form of protest action. It's saying that my lord has given me an order that I believe to be against my honor. Now, I cannot disobey him by the tenets of Bushido, so I will kill myself in protest of these orders and bring shame to my lord's name. At least that was the originating principles. So when you're designing your honor code, think about shame and how it is enforced by the society around which this honor code exists. And if you like that discussion on shame and honor codes, hit the thumbs up button and let's talk about actual specific honor codes. So in order to tackle the subject, I'm going to talk about the two famous ones from our world, the Chivalric Code and the Code of Bushido. Starting with the Chivalric Code, which was defined really in 1170 to 1220. Now, the Chivalric Code had its roots in the much older noble habitus. So let's first take a look at those virtues. The noble habitus code was forbearance, hardihood, liberality, honor, being a good ruler, protecting your people, not oppressing them, and loyalty. So you can see that these attributes were basically about being a generally okay dude and not oppressing the people under you. And they were an outgrowth, a kind of fusion between the Roman cultures and the Germanic cultures. And out of this noble habitus grew the actual chivalric code, which of course there were many codified versions of. I'm going to take the kind of generally established chivalric code elements, which is courage, justice, mercy, generosity, faith, nobility, and hope. You can see where those origins comes from. Nobility comes from the be a good ruler, or it's sometimes called the Davidic ethic from David from the Bible. And you can see generosity coming from the same place. Of course, loyalty is there, courage and justice, and all of these things around your conduct on the field of battle. A great example of this kind of code implemented in a fantasy world is, of course, Westeros from Game of Thrones. Now, what is really interesting about the way that George R.R. Martin did this is that the code is there. And there are people like Sir Loras who pay at least lip service to it. They at least look like they're obeying the code. And then there are people like Sir Gregor Clegane, the mountain that rides, that clearly do not meet any of those virtues. And yet he remains a knight. Why? Because he doesn't care. The shame rolls off him. And that's the thing with these honor codes. If you have people who ignore the shame that they feel, the honor code starts breaking down. And that means that the society starts crumbling, because your society is not built on these strong laws. These are not enforceable strictures of law. They are things enforced by the society. The fabric of that society starts breaking down when you get people like the mountain that rides that just outright ignore all the codes and elements of the honor code that they're supposed to live by. Okay, so how does that contrast with Bushido? So Bushido comes from Japan, and it was the code that the samurai lived by. It was codified quite late, although it had an oral tradition going back a long way. The tenets of Bushido are integrity, respect, courage, honor, honesty and sincerity, duty and loyalty, and compassion. I am sure that you can see the thread between these, and I will talk about that more in a little bit. But first I want to talk about an implementation of the tenets of Bushido in fantasy, and that is Raymond E. Feist and Janie Wirtz's world of Tsurani, the Empire of Tsurani. Now the culture here is a very Eastern-based, very samurai-based culture. Shame can result in suicide, and it can be weaponized. In Daughter of the Empire, Mara, the main character, weaponizes suicide against her husband. So she makes her husband, she sets up a situation where her husband is so shamed he has to commit suicide. Even here, you can see the subversion of the elements of the culture. because this is where interpretation of honor is very important. And in the first book, we see this in the instance of Papaweu. So when Mara is grieving for her father and her brother dying on the world of Makemia, she goes into the contemplation glade where none but the family are allowed. And while she is there, she is attacked. Papaweu enters the glade and he defends her from the assassin. He saves her life. But none are allowed to enter the glade who are not family during a period of mourning. And so Papaweu is supposed to be condemned to death. And he requests permission to commit suicide, and Mara says no, and everybody starts preparing to hang him, and she's like, no, that's not what I meant at all. He must wear the black rag of the condemned. So everybody can see that he's under a death sentence, but I'm not going to kill him now. What this allowed her to do is to keep her best warrior in service, even though technically he should have died. And that kind of fine, nuanced interpretation of honor is what makes that first book phenomenal. It is one of my favorite books in terms of exploration of politics and honor for that reason, for that very, very fine nuances. In the second book of that series, Servant of the Empire, Mara gets a slave from Makemia called Kevon, and they start boning each other, whatnot. And then there's this one incident where Kevin needs to pick up a sword to help defend Mara. And there are other people there, other people of rank there, and they're all like, that slave can't pick up a sword. And she's like, well, that slave just saved your life. Did you see him pick up a sword? Because I didn't. And that samurai's like, nope, I didn't see him pick up a sword. And they're all like, nope, didn't see him pick up a sword. And that kind of blindness is another indication of that kind of nuanced view of honor, that sometimes you have to look away. Sometimes you have to be blind to what's right before you. And you can actually see the difference between what, say, Gregor Clegane was doing, where he just outright ignored the codes, versus what was going on in the Empire of Tsurani, where Mara still played within the rules, but she threaded a very fine, delicate line of honor. And if you like that discussion of Bushido versus chivalry, hit the thumbs up button. And let's talk about some other examples of using shame and what impact magic has. So first I want to talk about Avatar: The Last Airbender and Zuko's character arc. So when we meet Zuko, he is shamed. He's not guilty of anything. He didn't do anything wrong, but he did something that caused his father rage and shame, and his father exiled him for it. Now Zuko is trying to regain his honor, and that is his driving motivation. But through the story, Zuko learns that only he has his honor. You cannot give your honor away. It cannot be taken from you. You have your honor. And that lesson is then one that teaches him that he was never actually shamed. And that was a very interesting journey in terms of honor and shame and the driving force, and a character who doesn't overcome the original premise, but instead grows beyond the original premise to realize something deeper about his life as it was. So what you can say about Zuko is that shame drove him on his terrible path, but honor led him out the other side. The other element that I want to talk about, specifically applying to fantasy, is how honor codes are impacted by magic. And here I want to talk about D&D's paladins. So a D&D paladin has a code of honor that is enforced by their god. And if they stray away from that code of honor, they lose their power. And that is the impact of a real god driving a real set of behavior. So if Westerosi gods were real and knights had power based on their code of honor, Gregor Clegane would have lost his powers based on his behavior. And I think that it's very important to consider that in your world, especially if you have active real gods. If you have active real gods, why do people get away with breaking their honor codes if they do? Are the gods such that you can bargain with them? Can you thread a fine needle? Or do they look into your heart and see what you really mean? Or how does that relationship work between the gods and your honor code. And if you like that discussion of magic and honor codes, hit the thumbs up button. And let's talk about how to design your own honor code. So call me cynical, but you will have noticed that loyalty exists in both chivalry and Bushido. And the reason why it is often regarded as the most important of the virtues, is because, of course, these things are enforced and driven by a society with somebody at the top who wants the people below them to be loyal to them. So 9 times out of 10, your honor code is going to have something about how you need to be loyal to the people above you, because that just is how the cookie crumbles in terms of the people above you figuring out the honor code. There's also likely going to be something about respect in the honor code, and that's probably going to drive some respectful behavior in your society, like how you greet people, how you say goodbye to people, how you establish rank, and so forth and so on. You're probably going to have something about honor itself, so the kind of code feeding itself with that honor. If it is a militant order that is governed by this honor code, you will have something about behaving with courage. If it is, say, an assassin's guild tied to this honor code, it'll probably be something connected to never getting caught or never revealing the secrets of the order or something like that. Some kind of conduct around which this honor code is built, how you must conduct yourself in the theater that this honor code governs. The rest of it kind of depends on your society. Let's say you're a very heavily religious society, you're probably going to have something about faith in there. Let's say that you are a more philosophical-based society, like the Neo-Confucius society that gave rise to Bushido, then you're probably going to have something about integrity in there. And quite often, you will have something about looking after the less fortunate in your society, just to kind of make the code appeal to the less fortunate in the society, so that they can look at that code and say, well, that's what the knights are supposed to be. They're supposed to be generous to us, and that's why we, the peasant population, give them our loyalty. So without that element, what you will too often find is that the lesser people become jammed in a box by oppressive overlords, and eventually they will rise up and overthrow the overlords, which obviously you don't want, so you want to have some measure of compassion in your honor code. Then very importantly, how is it enforced? Is it the shame and the peer pressure of society? Is there an actual court of honor where you have to go to defend yourself if you've been found guilty of honor breaches? Is it a magical code of honor? So something happens to you if you break your honor code, whether by God or by magic or some other means. And how do you redeem yourself if you fail? Is it a case of death before dishonor, and if you're dishonored, you commit suicide? Or is there a path to redemption, a quest you can undertake, a means by which you can cleanse yourself? So give some thought to the shame of failure and how you recover from that failure.
So when one of my Discord members asked me to make a video about adventure guilds, I thought I'd do a quick rundown of some fantasy examples, maybe explore Eberron's adventure guilds a little, and that would be that. Ha! Little did I know. I went looking for the historical roots of adventure guilds, and that brought up the Condottieri of Italy, and that, my friends, led me down a deep rabbit hole into a whole different world of mercenary companies and betrayal dire. So today, let's talk about adventuring guilds, their sort of historical roots, and how you can use them in a fantasy world. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. If you like what I do here and you'd like to support me in making more of these videos, you can hit my Ko-fi page down below, where you can buy memberships or leave a once-off donation. Alternatively, I am a fantasy author, and you can purchase my books, the Sangwheel Chronicles, on Amazon, link down below to that as well. Okay, let's get cracking. The Condottieri came to rise during the 14th century in Italy. So first we need to talk about what was going on in Italy during that time. Italy was by no means a unified country at this point of its history. there were city-states that were active during this period. Cities like Naples, Florence, Venice, and then, of course, the Papal lands was a very great power during this period of time. Now, the thing about these cities was they had never adopted the feudal system. They instead had a craft system and a merchant system. And as such, they were exceptionally rich cities, much, much wealthier than the rest of Europe, which was doing basically agriculture using the feudal system, which is not a very efficient economic system. So these city-states had a lot of money, but they did not have a lot of spare manpower. Most of their people were busy making crafts goods. Most of their people were gainfully employed. You couldn't just raise an army by taking, extra labor from the farmlands. There just wasn't that kind of labor to spare. But they did have money. So they started hiring foreign mercenaries, foreign adventurers to fight their wars for them. The most famous of this was probably Sir John Hawkwood, who was an English knight, and he was a very, very powerful force in the Italian peninsula during the 1360s. He led a mercenary company called the White Company on behalf of the Pope. So the Pope hired him to take part of these fights. Now, I do want to say here as well, there is this sometimes misconception that the Roman Catholic Church during this period was a monolithic organization, and that what the Pope said was kind of how it went. But this isn't true. And you can see that very clearly, actually, in the activities of, say, Florence and the Pope during this period. So the Pope declared Florence under interdict and said, the city as a whole is bad, is non-Christian. And Florence said, "Oh, really? You say that, do you? Well, I'll tell you what, we don't recognize your authority, and we're going to hire our own mercenaries, and we're going to run our own church rites." And the people of Florence didn't quite buy this Florentine church, independent from, say, the Roman Catholic Church. So the Florence nobility basically coerced the Roman Catholic clergy into running the Roman Catholic rites despite the interdict. So there was a lot more going on to the relationship between nobility and the clergy than first meets the eye in kind of a brief skim through of history. The Pope's power was not in any way absolute. This was also the time period when you actually had two popes. You had a pope in France who, had the support of the Holy Roman Emperor, and then you had the Pope in Rome who generally had the support of the city-states. And this dispute within the Roman Catholic Church was only resolved much later. If you'd like me to go into that kind of weird proxy war with a religion, let me know in the comments, and I can. Anyway, back to mercenaries. So the Pope hired mercenaries, and the city-states hired mercenaries, and there was much shenanigans with these mercenaries. But in due course, the Italian second sons of the nobles and so on were like, this business of being a mercenary is actually quite profitable, and it would probably be better if we were the mercenaries because we understand local politics. So they started forming Italian companies. Now, at first, most of these mercenary companies were pretty lawless. They couldn't really be trusted and so on. But then they started to come companies who had codes of conduct and contracts that they would sign. And in fact, the word condottieri comes from the Italian word for contract. That's what it means. It is a contractor for war, right? And these condottieri armies were quite substantial. They could go up to 5,000, even 10,000 men, which is a non-trivial force, especially for that day and age. Now, these forces sometimes weren't paid. Most famously, the Pope didn't pay Sir John Hawkwood, so instead he gave him rights over a small city. And so John now had a fief here in Italy as a mercenary company. And that became a thing. So you started having mercenary companies that were running parts of the country. And the condottieri really kind of rose to prominence. During their heyday, they were a force to be reckoned with. But then it started to become a case of they became almost friends with each other, and the leaders knew each other, and they kind of got along, and they didn't really want to go to war. So often, instead of actually going to war, they'd engage in these massively complicated maneuvers, almost like war games, and the one who outmaneuvered the other one was counted to have won, and then they'd negotiate terms of surrender, and the noble who hired the condottieri, well, he was just stuck with that outcome, right? It wasn't like he could do anything. He didn't have his own army. And so the condottieri became this real kind of power in Italian politics. This lasted until the nation state started to arise, most specifically the French nation state and the advent of Napoleon and guns and so on. All of this contributed to the eventual decline of the condottieri within Italy as it became more common for nation states to have armies, which of course a mercenary company can't compete with. Okay, so that was a very brief overview of the condottieri. I will leave a link down below to a great book I found on Amazon about the condottieri if you want to investigate more. It's a very short little novel, only about an hour listening on Audible, so highly recommend if you're interested in exploring condottieri more deeply. I think it's pretty obvious where George R.R. Martin's inspiration for his mercenary companies came from. It was definitely the condottieri that inspired him. If you look at the Golden Company, the Second Sons, it's there in the names, it's there in their knighthoods, it's there in the way that they're organized, their reputations, etc., etc. So you can certainly use the condottieri as an inspiration for how mercenary companies might work within your society. But how do you get from mercenary companies to adventurers? And why did I say that they might be the historical roots of the Adventurer Guild? Well, for that, I want to turn to Catherine Kerr and her silver daggers. So, Catherine Kerr's silver daggers were first a mercenary company. Now, I need to explain here that these mercenary companies were extremely common during a period of time when the throne of Devery, the throne of the kingdom in which the stories are set, was empty. And you had mercenary companies who would hire themselves out to various barons and dukes and so on, all of whom were making war and vying for the throne. Now, the Silver Dagger Mercenary Company was such a company, and they had lost a fight. And they were down to like 15 men, and they weren't doing that great, and so on. And so their leader decided to come up with this idea for how to cheer them up. And he had a dwarven smith manufacture for each of them a silver dagger, a literal silver dagger. And this gave them a sort of sense of pride and identity. Okay, cool, so this would just have been a mercenary company. But during this period where you had this whole like wartime situation and empty throne, the main mage of the Devery kingdom came up with a cunning plan to solve this empty throne problem, and that was to have a chosen king. Except he wasn't going to bother to wait for the gods or the spirits or anyone else to choose a king. He was going to pick himself a royal brat, make sure that that kid had a good education, and just provide all the omens that he needed to provide by using magic. So he did that. He identified the bloodline that he wanted to use, and he put in place all the omens to get this prince on the throne. But he wanted some serious protection for the kid, and so he hired a mercenary company, and he hired the Silver Dagger Mercenary Company. Okay, cool. So the Silver Daggers were instrumental in putting the prince on the throne and in filling the throne. After the prince became the king, he banned all mercenary companies except the Silver Daggers, because obviously these were huge military forces in his kingdom. He couldn't afford to have these mercenary companies available to his enemies, not all of whom rolled over just because he's the God-touched king. Then it was his grandson who actually disbanded the Silver Daggers themselves. Now, because they had been so instrumental in solving the kingdom's problems, he didn't completely outlaw them. But what he said was that Silver Daggers could only ride together in pairs or at most trios. So that made it so that the Silver Daggers were no longer a mercenary company. They were now the refuge of an outlaw man. If you were an outlaw, you could find another Silver Dagger. You could ride with them for a while and prove that you still had some modicum of honor, that your word could be trusted. If that Silver Dagger approved of you, he would then take you to one of the smiths who make these Silver Daggers, and he would swear you to the band and see to it that you had your own Silver Dagger made. And that would then result in you being a Silver Dagger, an outlaw man who hires your sword out for service, a mercenary, but one who is trusted to keep his word. And that's what the Silver Daggers mean. So this was a very loose organization of fighting men, of adventurers who hired themselves out to various lords. And what the Silver Dagger means is that they can be trusted to honor their word. And that is how you could get from a mercenary company to a more adventurer structured organization that is a loose kind of, not exactly a guild, but at least a shared set of values. So if you enjoyed that exploration of mercenary guild to adventurer, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about that Errant guild that I was talking about. Now, in a more D&D style of world, where you have adventurers who are better than common people at dealing with certain kinds of problems, people who go out and beat up monsters for their loot, or people who solve bandit problems, or otherwise are, role-playing, adventuring types, you could have something like an adventurer's guild. So in the world of Eberron, there is such a guild. These are professional adventurers who pool their resources and their contacts. They provide guild halls where adventurers can stay. They provide certain stores and services, things like identify magic items or even purchase of some magical equipment, or potentially working through the guild to get magical equipment made for cheaper prices with the other guilds. They also provide a means to get in touch with people who need adventurers. So you can have anything here from like a board that has jobs on it to, people who come to the guild specifically to say, I have a really dangerous job, I need these kinds of people. Now, for the services, the Eberron guilds charge annual dues, and you require the approval of the kind of ranking members of the guild. You can also, in this case, have guild politics between different adventuring guilds where they could either work together or they could be rivals and try and outdo each other at every time and, have like them send adventurers against adventurers to fight for like dominance and supremacy in a city, which could make for a very interesting and conflict setup. So how do you make your own in your fantasy world? And why would you? Well, the benefit of an adventuring guild or even just a loose association is that it gives you a place to draw characters from that move from place to place and solve problems. It gives you a way to have a character that is an outsider to society, so they can move around more freely, but is still trusted by society due to their affiliation with an organization that society trusts. So the real question is, do you need an adventurer type in your world? Do you need to have your character move around in different places and interacting with different people? If the answer is yes, potentially an adventurer type guild or association can provide you with a very smooth, organic way of having that character be trusted in the different cities and areas that they go to. Okay, cool. So maybe you do have an adventurer guild. First, you need to ask yourself, is it a loose affiliation or is it an actual formal guild? If it's a loose affiliation, how do people join? Why would they join? Like, what do they get from joining? What are the principles of this loose association? What does it mean if you're a silver dagger? Does it mean you're honorable? Does it mean you can be asked to do anything? Does it mean you're a thief? What does it mean? And how are those principles enforced? If you are found out to have lied, would the other silver daggers hunt you down? Would they come and strip your dagger away from you? How would it work? And if you go for a more formal guild, what does that guild offer? What is required for you to join? What are the penalties for not joining? Remember, guilds often enforced membership by making it untenable not to be part of them. Does the Adventurer Guild do that? Are you just frozen out of all jobs if you don't join the guild? And then, of course, with such organizations comes rivalry and inter-guild politics, which always provides you with fun threads to pull on if you need additional stories. I swear, it doesn't matter how often it happens. Every time I read about space marines landing on a planet, it sends chills up my spine. There really is something about elite warriors and their role in world building that is absolutely awe-inspiring. But then I like a good war movie too, so maybe I'm just prejudiced. Still, elite warriors open up a whole vista of world building and thematic opportunities for your story. In a world ruled by sword and sorcery, what does it take to make the best of the best? Are they shaped from birth or do they become great with experience? What difference do those two methodologies make to the feel of the elite warrior in your world? Today, I want to explore the creation of the very best soldiers, starting in our own history's ancient past with Sparta. We'll stop by Japan and then we'll transition through the movie Soldier and Voldemort into the greatness that is the Dune Sardaukar and Space Marines from Warhammer 40k. In each case, we'll dive deep into the forces that shape these warriors and explore the thematic elements that this opens up from a story potential perspective. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. So, when we talk about elite soldier in this context, we're referring to a specific tier of military hierarchy. Units recognized in their respective worlds as the pinnacle of martial prowess, whether through physical strength, magical abilities, or other extraordinary traits. So first we should talk about training and creation. And let's start with a historical example. And our journey is going to start in Sparta with her warriors. Now, Spartan warriors' training was extensively documented by Plutarch some centuries after Sparta's prime. And while it might not be fully accurate, it offers a wealth of inspiration for us as world builders. So according to Plutarch, Spartan boys were removed from their homes at age 7 and subjected to a severe regimen. Those of them who weren't unalived for not being sufficiently manly men at 7 So they became part of these regiments, and they were subjected to this incredible training regime, which fostered a culture of unparalleled military excellence. Spartan boys were basically set against each other in competition, and if they were inspected in the nude, and if they didn't live up to expectations, they were flogged. They were also kept hungry so that they had to learn to steal food and other such activities. So it was a very, very brutal training regime, according to, as I say, according to Plutarch. This Spartan methodology echoes in Douglas Hill's Young Legionary, which is set on the hostile planet Muros. Here, youngsters endure extreme training mirroring Spartan disciplines, albeit in a more sanitized form because this is aimed at younger readers. The planet's armies, renowned for their elite status, are rented out to other worlds. So you can see this whole concept of the entire planet being a military elite force echoing back to Sparta, whose entire population was supposed to be this military force. A far darker and adult-orientated iteration of this concept is seen in the film Soldier with Kurt Russell, where children are ruthlessly shaped into warriors from infancy, mirroring that Spartan ruthlessness, especially in the elimination of those who fail to meet the ideal soldier standards. So this is basically taking children and molding them into weapons of war. That is the base creation method here. So our next base creation method, we'll talk about the Knights Templar, who blend religious fervor with military discipline. So Templar Knights were typically noblemen, and they underwent rigorous training in various disciplines. Their dual role as warriors and as proto-bankers presents a unique angle on elite soldiering, where they gathered an enormous level of wealth. I talk about Templars in my video on banking, which you can check out in the information card, and is well worth checking out because it is a very curious source of events. But they essentially amassed wealth because of their elite soldiering. But what I want to focus on here is how their religious fervor, their dedication to God and the Christian ideals, molded them as an elite unit. In fantasy, that theme is echoed in Warhammer 40k's Space Marines, genetically engineered super soldiers representing a stark contrast to historical example where lineage and training was the more important part. With our Space Marines, it's more about their genetic gene seeds. But the fierce loyalty and dedication of the Space Marines draw a parallel to the Knights Templar, for me anyway. So Space Marines are basically these 7-foot-tall elite soldiers wearing power armor. They've got extra hearts and all kinds of things. They've been massively genetically modified. But their origin still lies in their genetic birthright, even though it's an implanted birthright. So we have the molding of children, whole population, versus a kind of genetic selection, noblemen, or the genetic selection of implanting a gene seed in creating your super soldiers. Okay, but we have another one, and for this historical example, I am going to turn to the Far East and Japan's samurai. Now, Japan's samurai, of course, practice the code of Bushido, and I talk about honor codes in my video on the topic if you want more information on that. But what I actually want to discuss here is that while many samurai were born into their roles, there were also some who made their way into schools based on how well they performed, who they impressed, peasants who managed to work their way up through sheer dedication to their art, and then were chosen by the schools to then learn further these samurai techniques and become samurai despite starting life as peasants. So they were chosen by the schools and chosen because of their talents. That, for me, draws parallels to Jedi Knights from Star Wars and Mercedes Lackey's Heralds of Valdemar. And the reason why this resonates for me is because in both these cases, we have the people being chosen by an external force. But the force, sorry for the pun, the force chooses the Jedi, and this then results in them being taken from their families and molded into Jedi Knights. And in the Heralds of Voldemort case, the mystical companions chooses the herald potential, and then they are further trained once they have been chosen. So you can go with created as child warriors, genetics, or you're chosen by an external agency of some kind, and then from there on trained. Okay. So those are the 3 creation methods we've discussed so far. There is one more that I don't think there is a parallel for in our world, and that is Dune's Sardaukar. So Dune's Sardaukar offers a unique perspective. Originating from Salsa Secundus, their harsh environment molds them into elite warriors. Their use of Salsa Secundus as a prison planet for training after they become the gods of the Padishah Emperor emphasizes the survival of the fittest ethos, further honoring their elite status. Basically, the Sardaukar use this prison planet. They send political prisoners to this planet, and they're given a minimum of training, and then they're, the fittest survive on this planet. And, the Sardaukar watch them and kind of select them from there. And these prisoners become the new recruits of the Sardaukar, having been molded in this harsh prison planet environment. Okay, but why does all of this matter? So understanding the creation and training process of elite soldiers is crucial, not just for their development, but also for the societal impact they have. The Sardaukars' transformation from prisoners to elite guards, soldiers' exploration of identity and worth beyond soldierhood, and the Heralds of Valdemar's role in maintaining societal balance exemplify the impact that these creation processes have on the society. Elite soldiers can arise from various origins. Born into it, like Muros's legions. Genetically born, like Space Marines. Chosen by external forces, like Heralds of Valdemar and Jedi Knights. Or forced into it, as seen by the use of prisoners of the Sardaukar. And each of them has a thematic impact, which we will discuss in the next section. So if you found this discussion of creation processes for super soldiers insightful, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about narrative roles in the story. Okay, so let's start with the cost of loyalty. Both the Sardaukar from Dune and Warhammer 40k Space Marines exhibit an extreme loyalty to their rulers, often at the expense of their personal identity and moral integrity. This intense devotion serves as a compelling lens to explore themes of dehumanization and moral conflict. The Jedi Knights from Star Wars, though less extreme, also grapple with this dilemma. Their steadfast adherence to the Force and the Jedi Code frequently collide with personal beliefs, culminating in Anakin's tragic downfall. And this underscores how blind loyalty can precipitate a loss of individuality and ethical grounding. Elite warriors, by their very nature, also allow us to approach the human element of warfare from a very unique angle. Unlike ordinary soldiers who are focused on survival, elite soldiers like Kurt Russell's character in Soldier and the Heralds of Voldemort from Mercedes Lackey's world confront the war's impact on their very essence. Their stories often revolve around the tension between their warrior identity and their humanity, exploring how war shapes one's approach to duty and conflict. Because these characters are not so much concerned for their survival as for what impact the war has on them, it allows you to explore war through this very different lens. Another thematic aspect that you can explore through Elite Warriors is the morality of creating warriors. The Space Marines and the Sardaukar, again, represent individuals shaped for war, deprived of choice and a normal life. This raises ethical questions about the transformation of humans into living weapons. Is it right to take a child and to transform them into a soldier? And this is a question you can thematically ask by using these elite warriors. And then don't forget about the political implications of introducing elite warriors. Elite units like the Jedi and the Heralds of Voldemort can be stabilizing forces, while the Sardaukar, akin to Rome's Praetorian Guard, demonstrate how military can become the bedrock of political power. These soldiers can either stabilize or disrupt the political landscape, often wielding influence far beyond their intended purpose. And these themes are not confined to fiction, they mirror real historical contexts. The Templars grew so powerful that the King of France accused them of heresy, got the Pope on board with it, and the Templar organization was disbanded because of Philip's accusation. So think about the political impact that these elite soldiers have. We can see it in history, and we can certainly see its impact where it's used in fiction. You can even tell a story where the elite soldiers are standing against corruption, and then, like Philip did, they get disbanded because they are the adversary of corruption. And one or two of them then become your protagonists, who are these lone gunmen combating corruption and bringing down the evil regime, which is also a very interesting thematic part to explore. When you're crafting your elite military unit, consider these thematic elements. What role do you envisage for these soldiers? Are they going to be a force upholding a political regime? Are they going to be a catalyst for change? Perhaps a symbol of the resistance against corruption? Their creation, their training, and their purpose should align with the thematic narrative you want to explore in your world. If you want to tell a story of standing against corruption, don't build a Sardaukar type organization. If you want to tell a story of gritty realities of wielding political power, perhaps something like the Sardaukar or the Space Marines will suit you well. Think about what you want to do with this elite unit, and then take that into consideration in building how they are created, how they are picked, how they are trained, and how they are created. And those were my thoughts on elite military warriors in fantasy worlds. So, today is the final episode of How to World Build a Knight, and I thought we'd close it out with a practical exercise. What was the day in the life of a historical knight, and how would that compare to a fantasy equivalent? Welcome to episode 4 of Just in Time World Building series on Knights with your host, Marie Mullaney. So we're going to do this by going through my A Day in the Life of exercise from Worldbuilding Blueprints. You can buy your own copy of Worldbuilding Blueprints by going to my website, and if you use the code NIGHT2026, you will get a discount at checkout on any of the digital editions, whether that is this PDF, which we're going to be working from, the EPUB book, or my audiobook. Okay, so A Day in the Life of is the last chapter in the book, and it helps you build out your cultures in full by going through different people's daily lives, right? So we're going to use that for nights, and we're going to kick off by going to the describe the home and hearth. So here we want to consider questions like, where does this person sleep? What is their home built out of? All of those kinds of details. Do they have any pets? Do they have any food animals? And so on. So the medieval knight obviously lived in a castle, for the most part. Some of them would have lived in fortresses, some of them might have lived in manor houses, some of them would have lived in somebody else's castle. The first castles were the motte and bailey construction, so they had the kind of bailey, which was a lower area, and the motte, which was the stronger area normally built on a hill. The important thing to always remember about castles is a castle is more than just a building. It's also a means of projecting power over the countryside. It is a strong point from where the knight can sally, and it gives him control over the area, right? And a castle housed much more than just the knight. Okay, there would have been a whole area for food animals. There'd have been a village around the castle where the peasants grew crops and where they kept cows and sheep and whatever, and they would have maintained the castle by paying taxes, normally not necessarily as direct money so much as through their produce. So they would have given eggs or cheese or cloth or whatever from their produce would have gone to the castle and to maintaining the castle, along, of course, with corvée labor. Castles would often have wells or some kind of stream inside the castle because of sieges. So once you have people besieging your castle, you want to be able to have your own water source so that you don't end up, dying from dehydration because you're being attacked. Of course, this was before your food preservation like fridges and so on and so forth. So unless you're in a fantasy world where you have the fantasy equivalent of fridges, your castle's going to preserve food through things like pickling and so on. The interesting thing, of course, is how would a castle change due to fantasy? And there's a lot of ways that you can think about that. So you could have magical defenses. You could have magical means of attack. You could have a mage as part of the defenses, and so you can have, like, instead of an archer's turret, you could have a place where a mage can stand and throw fireballs. And all those kinds of details would change how the castle appears. I did do a video on castles and fortresses and so on, which you can check out in the information card. And let's move on to our next exercise, which is hygiene and associated with it clothing. Okay, so here we're thinking about things like, how did people bathe? How did they wash their clothes? How many clothes did they have and what did they wear? So our classic medieval knight probably bathed alone, although there was some communal bathing traditions in medieval Europe, and there was certainly some sort of sweat lodge and sauna traditions, especially in the north. In Finland, for example, the sauna is a very long-standing tradition. But we have some evidence that knights mostly had like bathtubs brought to their rooms and that they bathed there. In addition, I should also mention, like I said in episode 3 or in episode 2, that there is a ritual bath that knights take before they are knighted that kind of washes away their sin. There's this persistent legend that medieval people were dirty. They weren't. They probably didn't bathe as often as we did, but they certainly did bathe. In a fantasy world, I think you can do a lot with hygiene. You can have communal bath places, you can have saunas, you can have magic involved in some way. You could create showers. Early showers wouldn't be that hard to create if you've got a reliable means of heating water and just pumping it up a pipe and so on. So you've got quite a lot of options for including magic into your hygiene. Then in terms of clothing, so knights had a couple of different means of clothing. Of course, one of the most important things you need to think about in terms of clothing is sumptuary laws, which I made a video about. That is what people could wear in which classes and so on. And secondly, heraldry. Heraldry was so important to knights because it identified them on the battlefield. And they quite frequently had their heraldic devices painted on their armor, or at least they wore a tabard with the heraldic device on. It might have been on a banner that they carried, or a banner that their squire or page carried, and so on. This was part of their identification means. It identified them on the battlefield, it identified them in court, it was part of their symbology. Okay, so you very much want to include that heraldry in your fantasy knights as well. But there's also the fact that knights often wore armor, which I spoke about in the second episode, where I spoke about kind of the gear of a knight. So you want to also think about armor and how magic influences armor, of course, either making that armor stronger, or perhaps replacing that armor entirely, or making the armor lighter. All of those kinds of things impact on what they wear. And then, of course, climate always plays a role with clothing. Food and drink remains one of the most interesting parts of world building, and one of the ones that is not used nearly as often as it should be. Food and drink's great. You can world build ingredients through it. You can world build strange animals through it. You can create a class hierarchy with food and drink. You can have rituals around food and drink, like a coffee ceremony, like they have in Ethiopia, or a tea ceremony, like they have in Japan. You can do a lot with food and drink. So, our typical medieval knights probably did have some kind of tea. Might have been made from berries or whatever, because tea proper, the tea bush, I'm not sure when that came to Europe. They might have had coffee, actually. Ethiopia is not that far from Europe, and there has been extensive contact between Ethiopia and Europe, and Ethiopia, of course, is the place where coffee comes from. So it's entirely possible that Europe might have had coffee early on. And then, of course, they very traditionally drank a lot of wine and watered wine and beer and so on, because the water wasn't always safe to drink, and alcohol made it safer, as of course did boiling and so on. And then in European knights would, of course, eaten a lot of bread, because wheat is the staple of Europe. So in your world, think about what is the staple food, how would they eat it, what is the imported luxury, what do they drink in the morning, what do they drink just before they go to bed, all of these kinds of details. Personal economics, so how do they make money? And this brings us back to those taxes. A knight wasn't just a knight. A knight was also the manager of a thief, right? A thief with a f, not with a th. And the fief that they managed had people in it who were growing food, who were growing flax crops maybe, who were weaving, and all of these things. And all of these people owed the knight a certain amount of their produce in taxes, right? And in return, the knight protected these people. They protected them from raiders and from other ambushes and so on. And the knight also owed allegiance upward in the feudal chain to the one above him and often paid taxes to the one above him. It's kind of like a whole little pyramid scheme. It's the pyramid scheme of governance, is feudalism. Made a video about that too. I'll link it in the information card. So that's how our personal economics for the knight works. And bear in mind also that there is this ransom culture with knights. So if a knight was captured or whatever, he might have had to pay out a lot of money in order to free himself, to get his armor or his horse back and so on. And so the knight might very well be broke and trying to extract additional wealth from his peasants. And speaking of that, just on that very same ransom and stuff, bear in mind that magic and fantasy can have a huge impact here, right? You could have a completely different way of taxing people. You could have resources that are magically orientated and so on. After dark entertainment. What did your knight do for entertainment? So knights did a lot of things for entertainment. They jousted. They heard stories told. They would have heard things like the Song of Roland as a story. They would have engaged. There would have been songs and dancing and feasting. All of these things were activities that knights engaged in, and they were also activities that knights invited other knights to in order to kind of flex their wealth. If you can throw a great party, it kind of flexes how rich and how wealthy you are and all of those kinds of details. So think about, in your world, how does that apply? Do you have bards? Do you have storytellers? Do you have people who put on plays? How does magic enter into that equation? Do they create a magical stage effect? What about sport and magic? Jousting was a sport. So what is the sport that your people engage in, that knights in your world engages in? Then we come to routines in the knightly life. Okay, so in this section we think about things like, what is the daily routine of a knight? So a knight's daily routine would vary quite strongly depending on what time of year it was and where in history we are, right? If he's at home and it's winter, which is not really the war season, and he's just managing his estate, his daily routines probably get up in the morning, take stock of his estate, maybe manage a few things, do some maintenance on the castle, do some training indoors. He would undoubtedly have done some sword training and things like that to keep his sword skills fresh for summer, and so on. In the summer season, when it's much more war orientated, he might have been living in a tent. He might be going to war every day. He might be participating in jousts. If he's not in a war, he might be traveling from tournament to tournament and engaging in jousts and trying to win these tournament battles, which would bring in income. In terms of weekly and monthly routines, we come back to those tournaments. Tournaments would have been scheduled events hosted by different kingdoms and knights and counts and nobles of various kinds. And tournaments were the opportunity, of course, for a knight to gain status and wealth. Then yearly routines were tightly tied to the kind of Christian calendar, and knights would, celebrate Christmas and various saints' days and so on. And then in terms of life events, one of the most important ritual would, of course, been becoming a knight. And when a knight went through the whole thing of bathing and girding their loins and getting their spurs and all the rest of that. And then, a knight would obviously have probably a fairly spectacular funeral, as their heir would then put them to rest and, take over the land. A knight whose child was born, who's, had the birth of a child, would undoubtedly celebrate that, because their whole system of governance depended on having a male heir. So especially having a male heir would have been important. And then, of course, at 7, a knight's child would have been sent away to fosterage to start their training as a page. So these are all kinds of life events in the life of a knight. So how would that work in your world with, your fantasy night. So think about things like life events and yearly rituals and what are their routines. What is the difference between being on campaign, being a tournament night, and being at home in your castle doing your kind of maintenance? Because these are kind of three different times of a night's routine. And then finally, we come to our what if questions in the day in the life of. And these are questions around how would a knight have traveled? So obviously in our world, a knight traveled by horse. And as I said in the training video, they normally had 3 horses. They had the jousting horse, which was the destrier, normally a stallion, and a very fractious horse. They had the courser, which was a calmer horse, either a mare or a gelding, which was battle trained and they used them in battle, but they were not the kind of fractious charger, the destrier. And then they would have had a palfrey, which is a easy traveling horse that has a steady gait that you can travel with and that keeps both you and your war horse fresh. In your world, of course, knights could have magical steeds. They could travel via teleportation. They could travel via mage. There's all kinds of different ways in which you can work with travel. I did a video about travel as well. I'll put that in the information card. Communication near and far. So knights in our world communicated by means of letter that they sent either via pigeon or courier. But you could build a postal service. You could have a magical means of communication. I did that in my world in Sangwheel Chronicles. I have magical birds that can find anybody once they've ingested their blood. So my nobles have got like little ampules of each other's blood that they preserve using crystals, and then the bird eats those blood crystals and carries a message off to the noble. And of course, this has developed now into a whole system where the noble himself doesn't give the blood. What happens is the noble has a message receiver in his castle, and that's the person that everybody has the blood ampule to, and then only the select family can directly send messages to the duke or whatever, right? So think about things like communication, both in terms of like close distances, and far distances, and how magic affects that. And then, of course, we have weapons and warfare. So this I went into a little bit with the training and gear video, the second video, but it is worth researching kind of the time period that you want to imitate and thinking about how armor and equipment influences your knights. I didn't go too deeply into this because none of you seem that interested in the topic, and there are a plethora of channels who do weapons and armor videos. So I particularly like Skullgrim. I'll leave a link to his channel down below, and you can check out his channel for all kinds of details on all kinds of weapons. I also like Blumik the Archer if you're looking for archery weapons. Then healing and magical knowledge. This is actually quite a big one in terms of fantasy. Bear in mind that knights lived in the medieval period where medical knowledge wasn't great. They believed in things like leeches and like thinning the blood, bleeding people, which wasn't always the best solution. When somebody is sick, you don't necessarily want to tap the blood out of them. But in your world, medical knowledge could be quite far advanced or could be influenced by magic. So people could be way, way healthier and in way better condition than they were during our medieval period, just because they have more medical knowledge. So it is worth thinking about like how that setup influences your world. And then our last question in our day in the life of is potential threats and hazards. Now for our knights, that obviously came mostly from other people, but in your world, knights could be under threat from monsters. There could be demons. It could be any kind of situation where your knight is placed under threat by fantasy elements. Or you could look at political threats. Maybe the knight's lord is getting involved in a war that he shouldn't be. And now the knight's whole realm is under threat because of this potential conflict. So don't just restrict yourself to the physical threat and the monstrous threat. Also think about the kind of wider political threat and how that could influence your knight. And that is that for the Knight series. I hope that you enjoyed this closeout of the Knight series using the day in the life of exercise. How would a day in the life of your knight look? Let me know in the comments below, and I will see you soon for another. Hello and welcome to the end. You made it. Congratulations. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you got a lot of value out of it. Hit thumbs up and hype and all those good things. And if you are interested in buying the book World Building Blueprints, go to my website and you can buy it there. If you use the code KNIGHTS, I'll leave that in the description and pinned comment, then you will get a 30% discount on any of the digital editions. So that's the audiobook, the ebook, or the PDF version of the book. And otherwise, if you want more from me, there are other definitive guides. There's a whole playlist of them, or you could watch any of my shorter videos. And I will see you soon for another one.